Let us get rockin'. Let us get rollin'. Let us jump into the channel with Agent Smith.
Hello?
Yo, dude.
Hey, how are you?
Solid.
Oh, good.
I was getting extremely grumpy because I was extremely hungry, but then I had an extremely delicious bowl of ramen and eggs, and I feel way better.
Oh, sounds good.
Yeah. How about you?
Yeah, I had a pretty good dinner, I guess. Can't complain.
It was lunch for me because of my sleep schedule memes. In the StarCraft world, there was a really historic and satisfying outcome in the recent major tournament that was happening. There's a guy who he's kind of become a bit of a joke and a meme in the scene that he always gets second place. He's gotten in the finals more than basically anyone else, and he always loses. So he got to the finals again, and everyone's just cheering for him to break the curse. And
best of luck to him.
Yeah, he did break it. So he ended up winning, and it was very emotional. And I think part of that was because it demonstrated the general principle of just because you've failed at a certain scenario a dozen or more times doesn't mean that you should give up, because sometimes you can break through that. It was a pretty sweet outcome. A lot of people were cheering for the best non-Korean, who was the BlizzCon champion, but he was eliminated by the guy who won. So it was still a really hype and awesome outcome. And the viewership and everything was really strong, so StarCraft is in a very good position at the moment.
Well, sounds like fun.
Mm-hmm. And the thing that I did see this week in world news was the U.S. North Korea meetup and how that was extremely productive. They got a lot of stuff nailed down and ironed out and papers signed and all this, and it seems like we're going to move forward with a really detailed set of steps, right?
Yeah, not quite. Not quite. Yeah, unfortunately, there was a bit of an impasse during the summit, apparently. There was some disagreement on the scheduling of denuclearization. Basically, the U.S. wants denuclearization first, and then sanctions relief, whereas North Korea wants the opposite. And they apparently were not able to get past that. So Trump walked, and that was the end of the summit. Apparently, they had set up a signing ceremony afterwards, so it probably wasn't necessarily the plan, but that is pretty much what happened, and we'll see what happens from here. I don't think the fallout will be too damaging, because it seems like Trump issued some statements after the fact saying that he was hopeful that a future deal would be more fruitful. So it doesn't look like there's going to be escalation going forward, which is good. So there's at least that. There may also have been some disagreement on just what constitutes denuclearization. Apparently North Korea wanted that to include a pullout of the U.S. from the peninsula, as sort of the U.S. reciprocal move in exchange for full denuclearization. And then the U.S. also defined it differently, and that they defined it as including the full dismantling of the nuclear program and related weapons programs. So not just nuclear facilities, but also all facilities and infrastructure related to the development of specifically ballistic missiles, I think is what they have in mind. So those disagreements didn't help either. And the result was what we got, the impasse. Well, go ahead.
Yeah, to boil it down for people who kind of are like, wait, what? It's kind of like a you go first, no you go first, no you, no you, no you, and then they couldn't really find middle ground, I'm guessing. It seems like it would be pretty difficult to iron out a compromise for something as multifaceted as that in a single visit.
Well, generally when you have big summits like that, there's a lot of groundwork that's done in the lead up by diplomats, lower level officials, that kind of thing. And it doesn't seem like that really happened this time. So that's probably part of the reason. It may also have just been planned that way. It may be that the Trump administration just wanted to send a strong signal to North Korea that it was willing to walk, that it believed it had leverage in the negotiation. So maybe a little bit of both, probably. Those are both. Those both seem pretty much within the vein of the history of the Trump administration's trade negotiations thus far. So, yeah, pretty believable, either one, really. There is a downside, though. The downside, well, besides the obvious, which is that there isn't any progress in the nuclear talks, the other downside is that the U.S. is kind of stuck. One of the things that was promised in the first summit is that the U.S. would cease war games with South Korea and the South Korean military. And it looks like they're going to keep that going. It looks like it wasn't a one-off just for that summit. They seem to be signaling that they're going to continue to suspend those war games. So that was kind of a big give for the U.S. side in the negotiations, and they didn't really get a whole lot in exchange. I think pretty much the North Koreans agreed to suspend their missile testing, but they're still building, they're still developing nuclear material and building nuclear weapons nominally. So the U.S. kind of gave something away and doesn't have a whole lot to show for it yet. And so long as there's not further progress in the talks, then that kind of just benefits North Korea. It's not a game breaker per se, but it's not great.
Mm-hmm.
So thus far, we're pretty much exactly where we were after the first summit. We'll see where it goes from here, but I'd imagine that there's going to be a lot more groundwork going forward in preparation of a possible third summit. And I suspect that groundwork will be more where the substantive negotiations actually happen. It also kind of puts the South Korean government in a bad spot, because the Moon administration over there had kind of played up the second summit as being potentially a milestone in South Korea-North Korea relations, because it was kind of rumored that there was going to be a peace treaty that officially ended the Korean War, which, for those of you who are not aware, never technically ended. Technically, we're still fighting the Korean War. That is not a resolved conflict. There was an armistice that nominally ended the fighting in the early 50s. I want to say 53, but there was never any peace treaty. And it was kind of hoped by the South Koreans that that would be a part of the second summit here, but obviously those hopes were kind of dashed here. So they're a bit disappointed, and the Moon administration kind of looks like it was cut out. Looks like it wasn't really involved in that, and that kind of makes the government look weak, which is not really a good look in South Korea. So they took a little political heat for that. I suspect further negotiations will probably involve South Korea more. There's been a lot more talks between North Korea and South Korea than there's been between North Korea and the U.S. So, like we've kind of talked about before, the South Koreans have been pushing more engagement with North Korea, sort of the good cop to the U.S. bad cop in the negotiations. So that's a dynamic that could continue going forward, and maybe the South Koreans could kind of pick up some of the slack from the second summit here. But yeah, it was a little anticlimactic. It just kind of ended all of a sudden.
Yeah, for people who are StarCraft fans, we have a lot of pro players who we know and love who have to leave the competitive circuit for a while to do their mandatory military service, and this sort of ongoing active war relationship is a big part of why that's a part of South Korean society.
Let's see. Well, was there anything else that kind of caught your eye this past week?
Not really.
There's actually a bunch of stuff that happened. I've got a pretty built-up list here of stuff to talk about. We probably won't get to it all, but if we run short of questions, we'll have plenty to chew on.
Cool.
Let's see. Well, I think we did have some questions, so I guess we could kind of dig in here, if that's okay.
Sure.
Can you talk about the political economic climate that led to the breakup of Bell Systems in 1984? Do you think any companies are approaching a similar situation today? That's a good question. I don't know that much about the breakup of Bell Systems. For those who are not familiar with Bell, and I hope I'm getting this right too. I believe Bell Systems was a large phone company that pretty much monopolized the market up until relatively recent, up until it was broken up. And it ended up getting cut up into multiple smaller companies. I think most of them have ended up merging back together in the decade since then, so not necessarily a lot of gain there, but nominally that's what happened. And I believe that's what this question is referring to. Yeah, I'm not that familiar with the individual case, so I can't really comment too much about it. 1984, I mean, just broadly speaking, the political economic climate was very much deregulatory. You know, that was very much the heyday of the Reagan administration. They were kind of hurting a little bit in 84, I think, because the economy actually entered a steep recession sort of near the beginning of the Reagan administration, or was already in a steep recession. And that was because interest rates had been hiked to something like 20% by the Fed in order to try to deal with chronic inflation. And that sparked a pretty sharp, steep recession, and the Reagan administration kind of took a hit for that. But they were still pushing their sort of deregulatory perspective. That was very much the Reagan administration's perspective on economic policy. And while they didn't have as much political support as they would have later when the economy really got going, which is kind of more what the Reagan administration is remembered for in 84, I think they were still kind of pulling out of that recession. So the political climate was pretty conservative. That was part, the Reagan wave in the early 80s. The economic climate, though, was not great. The U.S. was still kind of pulling out of that 70s stagflation funk. And, a lot of people were hurting pretty bad in that steep recession there in that early 80s period. Yeah, it doesn't get remembered as much because, Reagan is remembered for sparking, or at least contributing to an economic renaissance in the 1980s. The 1980s is kind of remembered as an economic boom time in the U.S. But they actually didn't start that well. They didn't start that way. It was a pretty rough go in the first couple years there. So roughly, that's kind of roughly what the political and economic climate was. But as for how that related to the breakup of Bell Systems specifically, I'm not real sure. I think it tied in, again, I would have to read more about it, but if I had to guess, just for sake of giving you something more than just, I don't know, if I had to guess, I would say it tied into the overarching deregulatory schema of the conservative policy of the Reagan administration at the time. And that might seem counterintuitive, since conservatives in the U.S. are kind of known for being more pro-business, pro-corporate. But the Reagan administration, I think, did contribute there to the breakup of large companies. That is partly what they did with the airlines. And I believe this is when airlines were deregulated. I might be wrong on that. I think it might have been the 70s, but right around there anyway is sort of when airlines were deregulated. And so that was sort of what contributed to the death of rail travel in the U.S. It used to be that we had a lot of passenger rails in the U.S., but airlines kind of ate that up after they were deregulated in the, either the late 70s or early 80s. Again, I can't quite remember the specific years. But that was part of a drive to create more competition in the economy. So it wouldn't surprise me if that kind of contributed to the breakup of Bell. That was very much kind of a running theme at the time, to break up large companies like that. Well, not just large companies, but to just make large industries more competitive in general. The airline industry in particular was a good example of that, because before deregulation, it was heavily regulated and almost planned to a degree. Individual airlines were kind of given routes, and it was very top down. It was not it was not a free market in air travel at the time, really. And it was only when they were kind of cut loose from those regulations that there was real competition, and that's what led to a big fall in air tickets, ticket prices. And on the one hand, that contributed to cheaper, more accessible air travel, but again, the downside was that it kind of killed rail travel, which was already in decline, but deregulating the airlines definitely contributed to that, which is why we don't really have them like we used to. You know, if you watch old movies from the 40s, 30s, and from the U.S., you know, a lot of the time you'll see characters, you know, running around using passenger rails of one sort or another, and we just don't have that anymore. It's pretty much gone. I think there's still some in like the Northeast, sort of up around New York, Boston. I think they've still got one in operation up there, but I don't think it really goes much beyond that. I don't think you can really take it to, say, Chicago in the Midwest like it used to, or even further than that.
There are quite a few in-state transportation mechanisms like that, like the light rail in Washington State serves the west side. You can go north-south on it. It's pretty efficient, effective, it's green, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, there's still some passenger rail in the U.S. I think we even have one in Texas here. Technically, you can actually go pretty far with it. I think you can go to the Midwest or even the East Coast. I think certainly to Houston anyway. But I don't think they have a lot of capacity. You know, not a lot of people really use it. It's just kind of cheaper and faster to use air travel. And that's kind of the case with a lot of other places too. You know, there is limited passenger rail still in sort of regional areas, but you know, the huge national rail network that used to exist where you could move lots of people relatively quickly, that doesn't exist really. You can't really do that now. So there's a meandering answer to that.
What about the break of the bell? Trains. Okay. Thank you.
Sorry.
That's okay.
I'll try to read more about it over the next week. Try to have something more for next week. Let's see. Have you been following the ongoing selection process for Chief Prosecutor of the European Public Prosecutor's Office? If yes, I would be interested in your opinion of the chances of Laura Kövesi, former head of the National Anti-Corruption Directorate of Romania, at getting the job. What do you think of the current situation regarding political corruption in Romania and the Romanian government's actions of voting against Kövesi for the job? I have actually not been following the selection process for the Chief Prosecutor of the European Public Prosecutor's Office, but I am actually familiar with this individual case because I have read a little bit of Romania's politics off and on, about Romania's politics for the past few years. It pops up in the news sometimes. So I actually do know a little bit about this. Kövesi, I guess I'm butchering her name, I'm sure, but this Laura Kövesi is what had been the head of the anti-corruption agency in Romania, and I'm a little fuzzy on the details, so please keep me honest on that. But basically, she was the head of an anti-corruption agency in Romania, and now she's kind of up for this broader anti-corruption job in the European Union. And the Romanian government has kind of been trying to sabotage her effort. I guess not campaign isn't the word I want, but has been trying to sabotage her. They don't want her in there. Romania has problems with corruption, to put it mildly. The political culture in Romania is still recovering from the communist era, where political culture was very corrupt, and it was just sort of in the political cultural DNA, so to speak. And communism is long gone in Romania, but a lot of the political culture kind of remained. The sort of attitudes of public officials did not change with the end of communism. That sort of is a legacy. And it's going to take a long time to kind of change that. That's a cultural change, and cultural changes are always very difficult and drawn out. Well, generally anyway. Certainly when it comes to corruption, it generally is. And it's exacerbated because Romania is still very poor. I believe it's still one of the poorest countries in Europe. So there's a lot of incentive to be corrupt, or to look the other way, as the case may be. It's a good source of revenue in a country where there's not a lot of alternatives. I think we talked a little bit about it last time, but not specifically this case. I think Romania was the country that tried to legalize bribery
Yeah, we did talk
a few
about
years
that.
ago. Yeah, we did talk about that.
You
So it's
can do
kind of an
some
example.
bribery, but we're gonna put some regulations on it. You can only bribe
Yeah.
so much.
Yeah, their concern. Well, the idea there was basically that any anti-corruption agency uh, that would be implemented, or that was implemented at the time, would just end up getting co-opted and corrupted itself, and end up getting used as a political bludgeon against the government, any given government's political rivals. So there was sort of an attempt to kind of hedge that by allowing some low-level corruption, some low-level bribery. The big stuff, the big bribes would still be illegal, but the little stuff would not be illegal technically. I don't think that law passed. If we have any Romanians listening, they can kind of correct me on that. But that's an example of how deep that sort of culture, that corrupt political culture, kind of how deeply ingrained corruption is in the political culture there. And I think Romania is also, I believe this is true. And again, this is something that people in chat, Kurt, this might be a good time for the usual disclaimer. As you can tell, I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. I have a stronger background in some subjects than others. I'm more economics and public policy, some foreign affairs. And beyond that, I'm probably not too much more informed than a lot of people listening. So I encourage chat then to participate. If I say something that's wrong, biased, stupid, what have you, definitely chip in and point it out, correct me. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So chat is definitely encouraged in that vein. I won't read the chat while we do this, but I will read it later, so I will see it eventually. So it is meant to be kind of more of a conversation. Generally, I learn a lot from chat once I go back and read through it. So it is meant to be interactive in that way. So let's see. Oh, what was I? Oh, hell, what was I about to get into? Yeah, lost my train of thought. Well, the point is, the Romanian government is not real gung-ho on her getting that anti-corruption position in the European Union, because it doesn't really want somebody, I think it's because they don't want somebody really familiar with Romanian practices, so to speak, sort of that culture there. So they would prefer another candidate. I think she'll probably still get it, because I think she built up pretty strong credentials as far as we know anyway, an honest prosecutor in a country where it's very difficult to be an honest public official. So she's got a lot of street cred in that regard, and I think they'll probably give her the position for that reason. I think one of the things that happened is that they tried to say that she was corrupt. I think somebody came out, not a politician, but somebody with political connections came out and said that she tried to bribe them, or asked for a bribe, rather. But I don't think there's any evidence of that per se. Yeah, beyond that, I don't know much else. That's pretty much the extent. Oh, that's actually what I was about. I just remembered. Okay. Yeah, Romania, I think, is kind of similar to Bulgaria in that a lot of the politicians and public officials that were in office in the last years of the communist government in Romania actually stuck around after the democratic transition. So a lot of politicians and public officials in Romania, at least the older one, they must be older by now, are actually still sort of former communists, basically. And so that old communist sort of corrupt political culture is particularly strong with them. And that makes it especially hard to change. So that's another example of how and why that culture sort of persists. I guess, what would you call it? Decommunization? That's not a word.
It is now.
Well, a lot of Eastern European countries kind of went through a process of trying to maybe not purge communist officials and communist laws and ideology, but sort of cleansing society to some degree, trying to prevent communists from getting back in power. But that process was relatively weak in some countries, and I think Romania and Bulgaria are sort of case studies in that regard. So I think that I don't know specific examples of individual politicians like that, but that's just I remember that was something I'd read before. Again, if we have some Romanians in chat, they can kind of correct that if that's wrong or elaborate on it. Let's see. What do I think of the current political corruption in Romania? I think we touched on that, and the Romanian government's actions. It's not surprising. It's the Romanian government's actions against Kövesi, and again, I apologize for mispronouncing her name. The government's actions in that regard are not surprising. That's kind of very much their wheelhouse. It's pretty much what it's a bit surprising in how bold it is. That's pretty forward, but again, given how much corruption there is there, I guess it makes sense. So let's see, that was sort of a all over the place answer. Let's see, what are your thoughts on the Cohen hearing and the ostensibly failed North Korean meeting for Trump? Do you think the discussions of a Cohen pardon are likely or even feasible given the circumstances? I don't get the impression Trump is really getting along with Cohen right now. I don't know that a pardon is really in the cards. Maybe they'll surprise, but it seems kind of unlikely at this point. I did have some notes on Cohen, and I guess I'll ask you, Neuro. Did you hear anything about this over the past week?
I heard that the SNL skit of it was really funny, and that it was favorable to Democrats, that they were more pleased with the outcome than Republicans. But that's about it.
I don't know about the SNL stuff, but yeah, the other bit was pretty accurate. Yeah, Cohen went before Congress and gave some testimony, and basically it was a lot of stuff about Trump and some of his behavior and et cetera, and a lot of it was not really, a lot of the stuff he described was not explicitly illegal. It definitely did not look good, but it wasn't necessarily explicitly illegal either. Now, there were two exceptions to that. There were two things that were somewhat incriminating. Cohen alleged that Trump took money from one of his charities to buy a portrait of himself. And true to form, but nonetheless, charity funds can't really be used that way. They cannot be used for one's own benefit. They have to be used for charity. So that could be a legal problem for Trump there. Depending on where the investigation goes. I'm sure the District of New York will, I'm sure New York State will be looking into that. And also the other thing was that allegedly Trump inflated the value of his total assets in assets reports that were submitted to Deutsche Welles while he was trying to buy a football team, that being the Buffalo Bills, apparently. And that would be technically illegal. Any misrepresentation of wealth and liabilities can form the basis of bank fraud allegations. So that could be a problem as well. So those were the two important takeaways from my reading anyway. I'm not as I've said many times on here, I'm definitely not a lawyer, so don't take my legal commentary to the bank, so to speak. But from what I read, those were sort of the important takeaways. And those could be investigated further, again, probably by New York. For those of you outside the United States, and maybe some of you inside the United States, the Mueller investigation is not the only investigation into Trump ongoing right now. There is an investigation also in the state of New York being made by I believe the Attorney General of the state of New York. And they're looking into other issues, various forms of financial chicanery and related matters. And that's separate from the campaign investigation that the Mueller investigation is looking into. So that might be a surprise to some people listening, that a president can be investigated by a state legal apparatus, not just a national legal apparatus, but that can happen. And there has been some commentary that it might be that it's the state level initiative, the state level investigation that ends up hurting him more. The Mueller investigation probably won't go anywhere. I've commented on that before. But the state level stuff could actually result in charges. Now, I don't know quite how that would work, because I don't know what happens if the state does try to charge the president of a crime like that. But the president of the United States cannot pardon someone for state crimes. He can pardon them for federal crimes, but not state. So that could create some interesting legal issues there. And if anybody has a more legal background on that than I do, please do kind of elaborate on that. I would be interested myself in seeing just how much a state could do in a case like that. But it may be that the investigation drags out beyond his presidency, and if that's the case, they could actually arrest him, since then he wouldn't have the same kind of legal protection that a sitting president has. So in that case, it would be kind of a moot point. But that is another investigation that's ongoing, and they could look into these issues that were brought up by Cohen in his testimony. And there also wasn't really anything substantive on collusion that was presented in the testimony either. Cohen said that he overheard Trump talking to his son about WikiLeaks being about to release some documents. But Cohen alleges that happened about 1 month after WikiLeaks had publicly announced that they were going to release documents. So not really incriminating. But yeah, that was my reading on it. So kind of just more of the same, basically. A little more theater, a little more drama, some more posturing, but not much traction. So let's see. What are thoughts on Cohen hearing? That's what I read. Austin, we already talked about North Korea. Do you think the discussion? Yeah. All right, I think we kind of covered that. Do you think, let's see, do you know much about the faked archaeological discoveries in Egypt? They are finding modern metal supports holding up so-called ancient structures, lots of cover-ups. No, I do not. That's news to me. Faked archaeological discoveries in Egypt. No, I don't really follow archaeology much, unfortunately. I probably should.
I mean, that's from the kind of ground level, a good way to make some quick money. If you're someone in Egypt and there's a very large interest in tourism, like ancient Egypt was one of the leading civilizations a long time ago, so there's a lot of remnants around and there's a lot of excitement around a new discovery. So if you can fake one, then just for the person who's faking that, you're gonna get some money in the bank if you can convince people that it's real. That's what it seems like from my perspective. I've been to Egypt, so seeing this stuff is pretty cool and exciting, and your average tourist is not going to be able to discern like something that's legit old and something that's real. That's what the experts are for.
Yeah, I haven't followed this, so I don't really know. I followed a little more marine archaeology because that's pretty fascinating. So there's a lot of ancient human development, expansion, settlement, etc. A lot of that thousands and thousands of years ago happened along coastal areas that are now submerged because sea levels have risen. So there's a lot of sort of ancient human history that's technically underwater now. And so marine archaeologists are kind of the ones looking into that. So that's a pretty interesting field of study. But as far as Egypt and modern metal structures holding up ancient structures, I haven't heard anything about that. So that's something I can read about. I'll open a tab for that. But for now, I can't really comment on it. That's new to me. Let's see, what do you make of the Mueller investigation? I was talking with a friend and he says that it was unconstitutional, but I'm not very familiar with the politics and legality of what's happening with the investigation. So any insights would be helpful. So there's a website that's called Lawfare. They generally, they're going to cover it way better than I can. So, if you're really interested, I'd encourage you to kind of check that out. It's not really their specialty. I think technically they're more into national security, but they've been kind of following the Mueller stuff just as it's somewhat related. So let's see. Is it I don't think it's unconstitutional. I know that argument has been made that you can't, you can't indict, I guess, or charge a sitting president. The Justice Department specifically supposedly cannot go after the president. But the investigation itself, I think, is legitimate. There isn't any constitutional restriction against the investigation per se. What they do with the investigation, though, there may be some limitations there, but I'm not real familiar with the legality there. just what the rules are. And I suspect not a lot of other people are too, because that hasn't really been well fleshed out by precedent. So I suspect that could turn into a major debate, potentially a constitutional crisis, depending on how things go. That's another reason the Mueller investigation probably won't go anywhere. It's just kind of easier. If the investigation is inconclusive, then a lot of those difficult questions don't really become an issue. Let's see. Politics and legality. So part of the politics comes down to who's doing the investigating, because there's been a lot of hue and cry about supposed bias on the part of the FBI and FBI investigators.
They're working for the Democrats. Oh no.
Well, that's kind of the charge. There's this idea that there was one of them who got in trouble. I think he was one of the guys who was involved with the Mueller investigation. He was an FBI agent whose phone records kind of came out and revealed him saying some very anti-Trump things to his girlfriend, his mistress, something like that.
Wow.
Yeah, a little bit awkward for him, but that's what came out. And so there was kind of accusations of bias on the part of the investigation for that reason. And there was also the whole Comey drama. Comey was the head of the FBI, and he's the guy who was involved with the Hillary Clinton email investigation. And he's the one who controversially came out just before the 2016 presidential election and reopened the Hillary Clinton email investigation because of supposed quote-unquote new evidence. And after Trump got elected, he got in trouble with Trump because he wasn't willing to let go of the investigation into that general who was supposed to be in Trump's cabinet. What was his name? General Flynn. General Flynn had kind of been an advisor of Trump during his campaign, and the FBI kind of started investigating him for some supposed involvement with the Russians, and they kind of did find some inconsistencies in some of the answers he gave to their questions. As a result, I think he's either been charged or is going to be charged, one or the other. And I think he made a plea deal to try to reduce the time he'll serve that involves him giving some testimony against the Trump administration of some sort. That's not really clear entirely, because that's part of the overarching Mueller investigation, and they haven't really released all that information yet. So there was the Comey controversy, there was that guy, and there was also, what was the other thing? Let me think here. Comey, blanking out. Oh, right. So part of the evidence on which the investigation was launched in the first place was sketchy. That was the famous Steele dossier, and which was supposedly an intelligence report that had a lot of information about Trump's malfeasance over in Russia specifically, but also other things. Basically it was just a traditional kind of political hit job. Just lists of things that were bad that they could kind of use against him in the campaign. They pretty much pop up in most every major campaign like that. And it kind of came out that I think it was either the Hillary Clinton campaign or the Democratic National Convention. I don't quite remember which it was, but they paid for that dossier. Not in the sense that they paid someone to make it up, but they just paid some former British intel agent to kind of go out and find what evidence he could and produce the report. And so nominally that Steele dossier was not the only reason, but part of the reason that the Russia investigation, the Mueller investigation, was launched in the first place. And so a lot of Republicans kind of cry foul on that because they say it's, not that report was politically biased and should not be, how should I put it? A report like that should not be enough in and of itself to launch a major investigation like that, given the nature of its origins.
One of the fun things that kind of relates to the questions people ask about bias in news in general is that everyone has a bias. So the people who are launching the investigation have some position they're working from, and the people who are of the party that's being investigated have a position they're working from. So they can kind of say, well, you're biased against us, which is technically true, but does that counter the legitimacy of launching the investigation? That's the question.
Yeah.
Because if an investigation is against a person who is a part of a party and it goes sour for them, then that reflects poorly upon the party in general, even if it is just a smaller set of people because the party vouched for them. So there is a lot of bias bouncing around in this. It's not like you're always going to have a balanced investigation of, okay, we're investigating a Democrat and a Republican now, so it's fair for everyone.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an inherently political process. Whenever it comes to investigating politicians like this, it always turns into a circus. You can kind of look at the investigation of Bill Clinton in the late 90s with regard to the whole Monica Lewinsky thing. For some of our younger viewers, to review the Monica Lewinsky scandal, basically, President Clinton at the time in the late 90s was investigated over an ostensible sexual act committed in the Oval Office with a White House intern named Monica Lewinsky. And Clinton lied about that. And so then there was an investigation into his perjury because it kind of came out that actually he did lie. So performing a sex act in the Oval Office is not really illegal per se. That's fine, technically. The problem was he lied about it. That was the perjury. And so that launched the Ken Starr investigation. And so they dug into that, or maybe the Starr investigation was already ongoing and that's what he lied about. I forget the details, but basically he got in trouble for perjury and he almost got impeached. In fact, technically he was impeached, wasn't he?
Yes,
I think the House, I believe the House of Representatives voted to impeach him. And then the Senate voted to not remove him from office. It was a more innocent time.
Well, the thing with Clinton, and this is kind of before I was an adult, so I didn't have the awareness, information, capacity to kind of process what kind of president he was. I was a kid, and I think you were too. But from what I've understood, his presidency had a lot of pretty questionable stuff in it in terms of his integrity.
Yeah.
So we talked several episodes back now, but Christopher Hitchens wrote a book about Bill Clinton titled No One Left to Lie To. So that kind of gives a little bit of context of the kind of person he was, and the Monica Lewinsky thing was basically the scandal that got everyone's attention, but as a person, I feel like there was a lot of stuff going on that people could take issue with. That was just the one that was the most saucy to talk about. Because some of it is going to be kind of boring. Like, he lied to some bureaucrat behind the lines that benefited him in some way and got him more power. But it was related to some international thing that most people don't care about. Whereas a sex act is something that a lot more people can relate to. It's a lot more of a simple kind of mammal drama.
Yeah.
Oh, look at what these people did. Oh my goodness. It fits more with the tabloid journalist mindset rather than the stuffy politician. Like, as a politician, he was a bad person. Well, he did some naughty things where he shouldn't have. And he's a married man. Bruh, family values. Bruh.
Well, it was also a different context at the time. There was also a lot of political competition, kind of like there is now, only maybe a little less visceral. Kind of been escalating with time. But the issue at the time was that there was divided government. Clinton was a Democrat, and the House and I believe the Senate too were Democratic controlled. Maybe I'm wrong on the Senate, but the House of Representatives was definitely Republican. And there was a lot of contention between the divided branches of government at the time over differences in policy and what have you. And the right really just hated Clinton for a long time. pretty much from the day he got elected. He was kind of, I don't want to say they thought of him as illegitimate, but they felt a little bit cheated in that 1991, was it, presidential election? No, it must have been two, because it was after the Gulf War. Don't quite remember off the top of my head. I want to say 92, chat can correct me. But basically, George H.W. Bush, who had been president after Reagan, was running for a second term. It was kind of assumed that he would win, and he had really high ratings after the Gulf War. That was a victorious conflict for the United States and its allies. So everybody was kind of really high on the government and the Bush administration. But then he raised taxes, which is something that he had very explicitly promised not to do when he'd been campaigning in the previous election. So that got him in a lot of trouble. But more problematic was Ross Perot. I don't know how many people remember Ross Perot. Maybe some of the foreigners listening aren't familiar with him. Ross Perot is the guy who founded Texas Instruments, the big tech company from here in North Texas. They're the guys that make the TI calculators and stuff like that. I don't know if anybody still uses those, but they make those and a bunch of other techie type stuff. And he was a billionaire, I think. He was very wealthy. And he decided to use that wealth to run for president. And he ran a pretty credible campaign. He ran on issues that a lot of people felt that the traditional parties had kind of ignored. Specifically, his big thing was the deficit and debt. Those were some big issues that people had kind of felt cheated on. You know, a lot of people had wanted the Republicans in particular, but some also the Democrats, to kind of cut back on government spending, and that didn't happen. So Ross Perot pushed hard on that and managed to pick up a good chunk of the vote. And it was probably enough to swing the election for Clinton. That's probably the big reason that he was able to win. I remember reading as much anyway. So some Republicans kind of felt that they'd been cheated out of the presidency to a degree. That if not for Ross Perot, then George Bush probably would have had it. There may be some truth to that. But regardless, the outcome was that there was just a lot of partisanship in the 90s. Again, it had been trending up for a while, but in the 90s it reached a new highs. And the Lewinsky scandal was one of them.
It's not quite the same thing, but you have a similar scenario with Bernie Sanders disrupting the party loyalty of Democrats. Because if you can get a symbolic candidate who's not going to win, but they get a grassroots following that gets enough momentum, it can take a big enough piece of the pie of one party to sufficiently weaken its unity so they end up losing the election.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've been seeing a lot of that lately. If Trump had lost the Republican nomination, lost the primaries and the primaries before 2016, that probably would have happened to the Republicans too, I would guess. You know, there was just a lot of sort of anti-establishmentarianism, so to speak, in the election process at the time. And yeah, Bernie Sanders was the Democratic manifestation, and Trump was the Republican manifestation. And as things happened, Trump was able to win, and Sanders was defeated by Hillary Clinton. And we ended up with something of a unexpected outcome as a result. Probably. There's different, you know, why and how Donald Trump was able to win the 2016 presidential election. That's a whole conversation in and of itself. You know, there's different factors involved. And lots of people have had very particular opinions about that over time. So if somebody wants to get into that, they can ask. I won't get into it now, but
we have talked about that in a lot of the episodes around that time. I think that was pretty close to when we started the segment. I think that was...
we started a couple months after. I think we started like early, mid 2017.
Yeah.
Right around there. Still can't believe that was 2 years ago.
Yep. We're on a roll now. This is episode 49. We're almost to 50. It's pretty sweet.
What are we going to do for the 50 episode?
Oh, we could do the troll one. And now it's time for the usual disclaimer. I'm an expert in everything, so whatever I say is inherently true by virtue of me saying it. And if you have different opinions, that means that you're wrong. Welcome to Agent Smith. Giver of all that is righteous and correct.
I thought that was going to be the April Fool's thing.
Yep, but that's the joke.
I don't know. Well, maybe it'll just be a normal episode. I don't really know. I don't know that we have a lot of scope to do anything unique for it.
We'll think of something.
I have been making a lot of progress on the on the podcast. I've gotten a few more scripts done for the first 3 episodes, so those are pretty much done.
One
Don't
thing
want to push
that
them out the door yet.
one thing that we could do that kind of fits with the really old school way that we used to hang out and talk about stuff is, instead of doing this like mass Q&A thing, we could also do a poll for the viewers and ask them if there's like a war or some historical event that they want to talk about, and we can spend a bit of a longer period of time to get deeper into a topic, because a lot of these we basically try to sum up something really fast, but we've watched a lot of like World War II Pacific Theater documentaries, and then we spend like 16 hours just talking about Pacific Theater. And that can be really rewarding because you get more of the big picture of something rather than just trying to hit the main points.
Yeah, that's true. We haven't done as much history stuff. We used to do more kind of at the beginning, when we started out doing that.
Mm-hmm.
There's a little more of a balance between history and the economy and public policy and current events. It just kind of shifted towards current events with time, because that's kind of where most of the questions were.
Yeah, and the number of questions we've gotten has increased too because the viewership has grown since we started. So
yeah. What do we have now?
Today's been a bit less because I kind of got on at a bad time, but we have like 500 now. Maybe maybe
right.
2 years ago we would probably have had 200 or 300.
Yeah. Yeah, you've been doing real well.
Yep.
Yeah, it is kind of a weird time, isn't it? Because I guess in Europe it's like 6 a.m.,
Yeah.
7 a.m., something like that. And then in Asia it would be like noon.
Mm-hmm. The vast majority of our viewership is from US, Canada, Australia, and Europe.
Mm-hmm. Well, good morning to you Europeans listening. Let's see. All right, so that's pretty much what I can conjure on the investigation. As far as I know, it's constitutional. You know, I'm not a constitutional expert by any stretch, but I believe it is legal. I think the problem is more just that there's a lot of accusations about bias that going around, and in particular, if there's any legal critique to be made, it's that the Justice Department cannot go after the president. And I know "go after" is not a legal term, but I'm not sure what would be appropriate there. I don't know if I should say indict or convict or what have you, but basically the Justice Department can't really do anything to the president per se. That's a legal argument anyway. So there's also that argument. But I do think it is technically constitutional. Again, I would recommend checking out Lawfare. I imagine they would have more on it. That's generally my go-to for legal stuff. Let's see. Okay, the next one was, when can we anticipate an end to the Qatar embargo, if ever at all? I mean, for now, I don't foresee any end to it. I don't think it'll last forever. It'll end at some point, probably. But for now, I don't think over the short to medium term it's going to be lifted. I mean, it doesn't really cost the Saudis anything to embargo Qatar. I hope I'm pronouncing that right.
I think Qatar is the official way that they would say it.
Qatar, okay. Yeah, it doesn't really cost the Saudis anything to embargo Qatar. So I don't think that's going anywhere. They'll probably keep doing that. And they'll continue to do it so long as Qatar continues to fail to adhere to the Saudi demands. And that basically is to adhere to Saudi diplomatic preferences and managing regional affairs, specifically doing more to cut ties with Iran, support the Saudis in places like Syria and Yemen, and to basically just stop being so independent. You know, Qatar kind of does its own thing in the region. They're sort of their own little power. They're not as powerful as the Saudis, but they have a lot of oil and gas money, so they have resources to throw around, and they've used those resources to kind of be a player in the Syrian civil war, at least, and also in other parts of the Arab and Muslim world. In Libya, for example, I believe it was I want to say the Tripoli government was supported by the Qataris. And then the GCC, led by the Saudis, ended up supporting the Benghazi government. can talk about Libya sometime if anybody wants. That hasn't come up in a while. I don't know that I can update anybody much on it, but I can give some background. But yeah, as far as the Qataris go, so long as they maintain that independent foreign policy of the Saudis and support conservative Islamic groups like the Muslim Brotherhood and whatnot that the Saudis don't like, they're probably going to continue getting heat from the Saudis, including in the form of the embargo. They would probably also like them to stop being so close with the Turks. Turkey and Saudi Arabia are not rivals per se, but they're not really terribly friendly either. It's more like with a lot of relationships that have to do with Recep Erdogan, it's kind of an alliance of convenience. It's very transactional. So there's Turkey, Iran, the Muslim Brotherhood.
I think Muslim is correct. So this is part of the thing with pronunciation it makes it extra hard, is you have Americanized pronunciation, like how an American would say it versus how they would say it. So I think there was actually an episode, one of our earliest ones, when you kept saying Muslim, and they were like, what? That's wrong. He's saying it funny. And then some people were like, no, that's actually how you're supposed to say it in the international way. Muslim is the American way of saying it. And I think Qatar is Qatar, like as Americans would say it. But they would say it as Qatar. People can correct us if we're wrong. Pronunciation is hard. We have a very American-centric perspective, so for stuff that's especially not English-based, we need all the help we can get.
Yeah, I believe the Arabic pronunciation is supposed to be Muslim, with an S, Muslim, and then as you pointed out, the English is Muslim. Or sorry, Muslim. But then I would mispronounce it because I would say Muslim, like with a Z instead of an S. So I was kind of getting them both wrong at the same time, which is impressive in a way. Yeah, I'm trying to think of what else the Saudis have been asking Qatar to do beyond those three things. I think that pretty much covers it. So yeah, just Al Jazeera, of course. Al Jazeera is of course the famous international news channel and news service, I guess I should say at this point. And the Qatari government specifically has funded that from the start. And it's notorious in the region for being sort of the Fox News of the Middle East. It's a relatively conservative news outlet. And they tend to give platforms to people that make regional leaders very uncomfortable. Obviously I'm gonna try to say it, Muslim Brotherhood leaders have been on there, as well as sundry other reformers and activists. And that really rubs a lot of the neighbors of Qatar the wrong way, hence the tension and the embargo. For those of you not aware of this, the English service of Al Jazeera is actually technically a different service than the Arabic news service of Al Jazeera. Those are technically kind of two different things. So the English version is sort of more well-known, and that's kind of what most people in the international sphere watch. But the Arabic service is the one that people in the Middle East watch, and that's a lot different. It has more of an editorial bent to it, whereas the international service tries to be a little more impartial. So the Saudis have been asking the Qataris to basically get rid of Al Jazeera. I think that was the request. Either get rid of it or significantly change the editorial stance, significantly change the management, something to that effect. I don't think the Qataris are going to do any of those things, by the way. I don't think they have any interest in pursuing the Saudis' diplomatic preferences in the region. I think they kind of have their own vision for the region. They're pretty hell-bent on following it. Mind you, part of the reason for the tension between the Saudis and the Qataris, specifically the royal families in the two countries, is that the Saudis tried to murder the Qatari royal family at one point, or at least tried to overthrow them. I think it was in the mid-90s. And the Saudis kind of funded this group that tried to do an old-fashioned filibuster, basically. And the Qataris never really quite got over that. So that's also relevant to the relationship. It's kind of what happens when you have countries led by families. You get some of those family feuds going sometimes. So for those reasons, I don't think the embargo is going to go down anytime soon. Going to be lifted, rather, anytime soon. And you've got me thinking about the Pacific Theater now. We haven't talked about that in a long time.
Yeah, there's a lot of meat to that. A lot of stuff happened.
Yeah, there was.
And I think it's less discussed than the European stuff.
Yeah, the Eastern Front and the Western Front, D-Day, kind of thing. I don't... Here's a question for the Europeans listening, if there are any. It's very early, I'm sure. Well, take a sip of your coffee. I wanted to ask, how much is the Pacific Theater of World War II covered in Europe, if at all? I'm curious the degree to which that's taught in school, or the degree to which individual people have kind of read about it or know. If the answer is not much, we could talk about that. It's a pretty interesting conflict, if there is indeed anybody that's not really familiar with it. And in Japan, they actually call it the Pacific War. They actually kind of consider it its own conflict. But America was kind of involved in the European War too, so we just call it the Pacific Theater, as opposed to the European Theater. We were kind of juggling different projects at the time, so it got its own special name. Yeah, over in Japan, it was the Pacific War that they fought with the US and the Europeans. And then there was the Second Sino-Japanese War that they were fighting in China at the same time. But those are sort of, I think, taught separately. I mean, in Japan, they're sort of perceived as kind of being separate but related conflicts. Someone can correct me on that if I'm wrong on that, but that was my perception. Let's see. Okay. How might universal basic income play out in America? Well, again, we've talked before about how long-term predictions are very difficult, but if you put me in a corner and make me predict one, make a prediction rather, I would still say that universal basic income probably won't happen in America. I think the culture is kind of too hostile to the idea of basic income. I suspect that to be the case anyway, and it will probably continue to be the case. I think more likely is some sort of mitigated form of basic income, a limited form of basic income to certain classes of people. Maybe people who are below the poverty line, or maybe people who have chronic diseases or something to that effect. But
well, the point that I was making was that for it to work, you have to appeal to the American sense of streamlined and efficient government where it's going to save the taxpayers money. Because you have to win the moderates and then maybe some of the people on the right for this to work. You can't just appeal to the people on the left because they're already kind of in favor of that sort of idea. So you need not just a mathematical representation of why it would be a good idea, but also an emotional reason of why it makes sense and why it's American to do this. I was joking about that on one of my streams recently, where a lot of times there will be a debate on a certain topic, but the winner of the debate is the person who says America and freedom more times, rather than the person who actually structures a better argument, unfortunately.
Well, that's politics. People, we've talked before about how you can't really expect the broader part of the population to be an expert on every issue, so people have to rely on heuristics, and some of those heuristics are how relatable politicians are. Not everybody uses that, but if a politician is relatable and trustworthy, or at least seems trustworthy, you're more likely to kind of believe them, basically, to go along with their policy platform. And so talking folksy and kind of being relatable is a part of that political communication, political language. That's part of building legitimacy in building the government's legitimacy and building a rapport with your voters so that they don't feel like they're being represented by a con man who doesn't really care about them. So there is method to that, although as you point out, obviously the ideal would be that you did have a more informed populace of voters such that they could kind of be more critical and be more particular in the sort of policy platforms that they supported of one sort or another. But you're right. It does depend on how basic income is kind of portrayed going forward, and that'll play a big role in determining, how much of one we end up with, whether we end up with one. And I'm still inclined to be skeptical, just because American conservatism runs pretty deep in a lot of parts of the U.S. It could happen more on a state level. That's something else that could happen. It could be that individual states implement either universal or limited basic income plans of one sort or another. But again, I would be skeptical. States maybe, but the national level, I don't doubt it. Maybe something like healthcare basic income, something very sort of niche and specific like that, I could see. Because I think you can make a stronger argument that people who have chronic diseases deserve help, because it's not really their fault per se. I guess depending on the disease, but people like that could be argued to deserve some kind of basic income style transfer payment to help them deal with their chronic ailment. So you could see maybe not that specific example, but things like that, or maybe a series of examples like that implemented. But an actual full-out universal basic income, it's going to be tough. That's a bit of a stretch at this point, I think. Again, that's just my perspective. I'm not sure that it's politically viable yet with a critical mass of voters, but we'll see. Maybe I'm wrong. That guy, what's his name? Andrew Yang?
Mm-hmm.
I think his name was, that guy running for president. He's basically running on the platform of UBI. He was calling it something cutesy. What was it? A dividend in America or something like that.
You need a cool tagline. Gotta make it snazzy.
I think it needs to be snazzier than that. I don't know that that's really going to snap with voters. But it's a fair point. Yeah, that's better than just saying give money to people. You're going to have to spend it somehow. Anyway, let's see. Would state convictions like the current New York investigation legally prevent Trump from running for re-election? I don't think so. I don't think they would technically prevent him from running for re-election. Because I think the state of New York, what would it be? If you break the law in New York, that doesn't really necessarily impact you in other states, per se. So New York might be able to do something to stop Trump from running in New York, although I don't think even that would technically be legal. But I don't think they could do anything to really stop him from running in other states. So no, I don't think that they could legally prevent Trump from running for re-election in the United States. Again, they might be able to do something in the state of New York, but I'm not sure on that. We'd have to ask somebody from New York. Actually, I'll open a tab about that, because I need to read more about that. New York investigation. 2020. Okay. I'll have that open for later. But yeah, my first take on the question would be probably not. Let's see. How frayed do you think the U.S.'s relationship with Saudi Arabia is becoming in light of the number of recent scandals, i.e. Khashoggi murder and Rahaf al-Nun as the case, plus the war in Yemen? Do you think we could see an end to the close relationship between the U.S. and the Saudis? I've heard the U.S. is not dependent on Saudi Arabia's oil like it used to be in the past, but not sure how true this really is. I would actually disagree with this. I think actually the Saudi-U.S. relationship is probably stronger than it's been in a long time. And that has to do with the Trump administration really warming up to the Saudis because of Iran, specifically. In general, the Trump campaign in the 2016 election kind of ran on more of an anti-interventionist platform, but they also ran on a very tough on Iran policy platform. They wanted to be tougher on Iran. They wanted to scrap the nuclear deal that the Obama administration had signed, and they wanted to put a lot more pressure on Iran to try to get them to give up their nuclear weapons. And part of that, once he got into office, involved getting closer with the Saudis, because the Saudis obviously had been asking the U.S. to do that for a very long time. They were very opposed to the nuclear deal, and they were opposed to what they saw as a kind of rapprochement between the United States and Iran under the Obama administration. There were even some fears in the Saudi government that maybe the U.S. wanted to try to end the relationship with the Saudis and create a new alliance with the Iranians, or if maybe not that extreme, then maybe have a relationship with Iran as well as Saudi Arabia, and then kind of play them off each other to some degree. So there were some real fears in that vein in Riyadh during the Obama administration. And when the Trump administration started up, the Saudis very eagerly lobbied them and engaged them. And so there's been a kind of bromance there between the U.S. and Saudi government as a result since 2016. So relations have actually improved. Now, as you point out, there's been some more recent issues, like the Khashoggi murder and the war in Yemen. So those are problematic, but those are the kinds of things that don't really matter given the context of the relationship between the U.S. and the Saudis. The U.S. government does not partner with Saudi Arabia because Saudi Arabia is some kind of beacon of liberty in the region. The alliance is very much predicated on strategic interests, specifically common enemies in Iran, and to a lesser degree Hezbollah and Hamas, sort of more around Israel. Saudis don't really care much about Hamas per se. They care a little more about Hezbollah, in so much as they're allied with Iran, and they care a lot about Iran because they see them as a major regional rival that's trying to overthrow the monarchy. So there's a common interest there, and there's also a common interest in ensuring that Saudi oil supplies are not do not fall into the hands of a hostile power, be that an extra-regional power or an intra-regional power like Iran that is hostile to American interests. And the Saudis, for their part, obviously the royal family doesn't want to lose the oil, so they have an interest there in keeping out outside powers as well. So it's a relationship that works because it's predicated on very specific objectives. There are very specific interests in play that keep them together. And, again, Saudi liberalism and decency and democracy are not among those reasons. So if the Saudis go and do something like murder a journalist or perpetrate some harebrained war in Yemen, those are problematic in so much as their PR, and in so much as their bad PR, but they don't really undermine the underlying reasons for the relationship. And so long as that's the case, the U.S. and the Saudis will continue to have a relatively tight strategic alignment with each other. Yemen is kind of their Vietnam to a degree. It's kind of something they didn't have to do, but they kind of felt that they needed to do more for diplomatic reasons, I think. Vietnam's something else we haven't really talked about. That could be an interesting conversation. Nobody asks about Vietnam. But yeah, Yemen is kind of similar in so much as the Saudis wanted to send a signal to Iran that they were going to act forcefully in any example or in any case where they suspected that the Iranians might be supporting a faction or trying to expand their influence. I don't think there was really a lot of evidence Iran was trying to do that in Yemen, or even is trying to do that in Yemen. But I think the Saudi government, specifically under Mohammed bin Salman, that is his name. I think that's MBS is the acronym that gets used. MBS in particular wanted to kind of make a strong showing, send a strong signal by getting involved in Yemen. And that was, again, just partly strategic, sending a signal to the Iranians, and also kind of an excuse to gear up the Saudi military, which hadn't really been used a lot up to that point, up until the war in Yemen. The Salman MBS kind of wants the Saudis to be more forceful in the region and to be a little more independent, because the U.S. has been acting a little weird over the past couple decades. Strategically speaking, we kind of lurch from lack of interest in the Clinton administration in the 90s to these sort of very ambitious, shall we say, interventions under the Bush administration, and then we kind of wildly swing back to disinterest under the Obama administration, and now we're back with the Trump administration. So there's kind of a sense among a lot of American allies that they need to hedge their bets a little bit until the U.S. kind of figures out what it wants to do in the world. And that's led to the Saudis in particular to try to be a little more forceful in the region and to be more independent. That's kind of a big reason why the Yemen war happened, or at least why the Saudis got involved. There are different reasons why the war happened. That's the Yemeni civil war, specifically. The Saudis kind of got involved after the fact, but that's more why the Saudis got involved. Some of that is the U.S.'s fault. The Obama administration kind of toyed with the idea of offshore balancing as a foreign policy, The idea being that the U.S. would not really intervene directly in states in regions of strategic interest like the Middle East. Rather, the idea of offshore balancing is to just kind of have relationships with everybody and just balance each other so that no one power can dominate the region. Sort of what Britain used to do in Europe for a long time. And so that made this. The quid pro quo there is that the U.S. would not intervene, but in turn they would give more free hand to local allies to do more of what they saw as being their interest, pursuing their own interest in the region. And for the U.S., the upshot is that you don't have so many wars where you have the army kind of deployed and fighting these interminable insurgencies. But then the downside is that sometimes your allies do things that you think are stupid or are not in your interest. But you can't really complain then, because again, the whole point was to try to pull out and lessen your involvement. So you can be deeply involved, but then have all kinds of problems with insurgencies and political tensions and whatnot, or you can be not involved so much, but then have problems with local governments doing things that you don't like. It's kind of a range. It's kind of a spectrum of policies there that you can pick among. But those are that's a rough outline of the trade-off. And as the Obama administration made the trade-off towards less involvement, the Saudis picked up their own interference in the regional affairs, and the result is kind of Yemen and Syria, to a degree. I'm not saying the Saudis are solely responsible for that, but the fact that they've been so involved it kind of stems from that shift in American policy, at least in part. It's a wild-ass tangent. How did I get onto that? Oh, right, the Saudi-U.S. relationship. Yeah, it's going to stay tight so long as the underlying strategic imperative is there. There's going to be damage control as far as the bad PR from the Saudis doing naughty things, and they'll get a tap on the wrist. If they keep doing it, there will be more substantive action. PR is not necessarily that important, but it can become important if there's enough of a public uproar, specifically in the United States, that maintaining the alliance becomes politically unviable, domestically speaking, in the U.S. So the U.S. government will probably tell them in no uncertain terms, never do that again. Or there will be substantive punishment and not the tap on the wrist that they've actually gotten thus far. In general, the U.S. preference is that they not do things like that, and that if they do it and not get caught. One or the other. But getting caught doing it, that's a big no-no, because that puts everybody in an awkward position.
One little aspect of connecting the dots that came to mind when you're talking about this is the pendulum swinging toward hawkish and dovish and left and right, and how the other countries in the world have probably figured it out at this point that the United States is a evolving actor, and how we're going to behave in a certain scenario depends on which side our pendulum is on, but it's kind of predictable that it's going to swing back and forth because, to quote Paul Ryan, being a governing party is difficult. So usually if you're the party that's in power, the people are going to see, oh, look at all these mistakes, this is obnoxious, and then they're going to vote for the opposition party until they have to try to govern, which is hard.
Yeah, there's a lot of impasse right now. That's pretty much the key word. Let me see. What do you make of the national emergency? What do you think of the national emergency to construct a wall along the U.S.-Mexican border? Would President Trump be able to have a sufficient clause to have it constructed? Yeah, I think we've talked a bit about this before. I think technically he does have the legal power to do it. Technically speaking, I think I posted a Lawfare article a while back that kind of dug into the actual legal details of the specific powers that he was using. And so basically he's going to divert some funds. The president has pretty broad authority to direct certain discretionary funds, so he's going to tap some of those. And he's also going to, I think, more controversially, use emergency powers to tap some funds for some quote-unquote emergency construction to build a fence, I believe. He can build fencing as is needed to support a military deployment to the border.
And it was the fence more like a wall than any other fence.
Well, basically, that's probably what he'll try to do. So if he actually does build a wall, that'll probably get him into legal trouble. He's already in trouble because he came out and said, "I don't have to do this," which is pretty much the opposite of what you want to say if you're trying to defend yourself from claims of abusing emergency powers. You know, the whole point of an emergency is that it necessitates immediate action. So that statement made in front of the media is probably going to come up in court and could come back to bite him. Wouldn't be the first time. Something similar happened when the Trump administration tried to pass the, what was it, the so-called Muslim ban. They did it again, the Muslim ban, rather. And that was justified as a national security move. Technically, the Obama administration had actually done the same thing. They didn't call it a Muslim ban. It was done on national security grounds because of escalating violence in the Middle East. But the Trump administration basically tried to do the same thing, but then he kind of wanted to call it a Muslim ban, and he did on Twitter, so everybody came up. There was a bunch of criticism then that it was not actually a national security policy, but rather it was just explicitly discriminating based on religion, which is illegal. So the courts normally would not be able to prove that it was done to discriminate based on religion if the government, the president specifically, says that there's an emergency and they need to cut immigration from such and such country. They generally give them the benefit of the doubt. You know, as we talked about before, the executive branch in a government, at least in a country that has, you know, rule of law and a strong judiciary, basically the judiciary has to give the executive discretion in how emergencies are defined, because there is no legal definition for emergency. That's kind of an inherently fuzzy term. And so you just kind of have to trust an executive not to abuse that power, or if they do abuse the power, trust the legislative branch to kind of rein them in with whatever powers they have to do so. And so that's what happened then, and that's kind of I lost my train of thought again. Well, basically that's the reason that executives have that kind of discretionary power, and because of that, the Trump administration is tapping emergency powers in that vein that give him that kind of discretionary power to build that wall. Or fence, or, you know, whatever the hell it is. So yes, technically he can do that. Whether or not it'll survive in court or not, that's kind of more dicey. You know, again, there's that statement that he issued, and there's some issue as to whether or not it's really an emergency. Again, they'll defer to the president on that, but there's still some evidence, and there's going to be argumentation that it's not. And then there's going to be inevitable criticism about where the money is coming from, so that'll be probably a separate lawsuit. And there's the actual letter of the law, whether or not he's actually building fencing to support a necessary military deployment. That's going to be subject to a lot of debate in itself, so that could well be a third separate lawsuit. We'll see. But as far as this specific question, yes, technically he can. Do you think Puerto Rico will become a state? They're currently a territory. The general opinion of the people seems to be somewhat divided. What would be the benefits, disadvantages for Puerto Rico to become a state? This question comes up weirdly frequently.
It's our new Bitcoin question.
Yeah, we used to get Bitcoin questions all the time when we first started this 2 years ago. It was the first, I guess, 6 months to a year. We got pretty regular Bitcoin questions. I think that's when Bitcoin was really taking off. Yeah. It was really going up in value at the time. I think that may have sparked the interest there. Let's see. Do you think Puerto Rico will become a state? No. There's not sufficient support for any change in the equilibrium, in the status quo. You know, in general, the largest cohort of among Puerto Rican voters wants to remain a commonwealth with the U.S. There's a sizable portion of voters who want to become a state, but it's not really enough to win a referendum outright. And then there's also a small minority that want outright independence. Let's see. So what would be the benefits, disadvantages of statehood? The benefit is that they would get more federal resources. You know, nominally, they might, you know, maybe you could argue they would get more attention, because there was a lot of criticism over the whole FEMA response to the hurricane that hit a while back. I don't know whether or not that would be true, though. That's a whole other issue I would have to read up on. But certainly they would get a lot more resources. They would get, you know, probably more federal spending, et cetera, et cetera. They would. One of the big benefits, and this is one of the big reasons that people want to become a state, states can legally file. This is going to be a gross simplification, so if you have a legal background, try not to laugh at me. But states can technically file for bankruptcy. If they have debt problems, they can use the legal system rather to restructure their debt, and that forces their creditors to accept that restructure. No such recourse is available to Puerto Rico as of now. And if you've been following Puerto Rico politics, you know that Puerto Rico is suffering from a lot of debt, has a big debt problem. But right now, they can't really force their creditors to restructure it. And so that's creating some problems for them. So if they did become a state, they would be able to use that legal mechanism to deal with that debt problem. So that's one of the big advantages. Some of the disadvantages, well, I guess I should point out quickly, one of the other benefits is that they would get representation in Congress. Technically, they do have a representative in Congress, but he does not have the power to vote on anything. He's purely an observer. So they would have actual voting members of Congress if they became a state. That's another benefit. So some disadvantages, for one, they would have to pay taxes. They already pay some federal taxes. We kind of went over that last week. But they would have to pay federal income tax. Everybody would have to pay federal income taxes. And that would be that would represent a pretty significant increase in taxes. That would be a big disadvantage. They would also lose autonomy. Right now, they're subject to the U.S. Constitution, but beyond the U.S. Constitution, they can pretty much write their own laws. Whereas if they become a state, they'll be much more subject to federal laws in a way that they are not now. I believe that's true anyway. So they would lose some autonomy, and they would have to pay a lot more in income taxes. Those are pretty much the big disadvantages that I'm thinking of off the top of my head. I think there's also the Jones Act. So there was a lot of controversy over the Jones Act because of the hurricane. The Jones Act, if you're not familiar with it, basically requires that U.S. territories have to be served with American ships. So the container ships, the transport ships, the merchant ships that supply the U.S. islands, those have to be American-owned and operated. And that's kind of a problem because there's not really a lot of American shipping left. A lot of it is international now. And as a result, the rates that Puerto Ricans pay to have stuff shipped are higher than they would be if they could just use international shipping like other islands in the Caribbean. I did a little bit of reading about that after the hurricane. I think me and PactFact actually kind of had a conversation about that at one point. And from the reading I saw, I think that's not entirely true. I think there was some research done on the Jones Act and the impact it has on the Puerto Rican economy. And I think the impact was, I think the report was inconclusive. So it's not entirely clear that it's actually bad. It's not necessarily bad. Obviously, rates are probably a bit higher. Not necessarily as much of a problem as it's made out to be, economically speaking. I would need to go back and look at my notes on that, to kind of commit on that. But I do remember kind of reading something to that effect. There was something about that issue that was not entirely accurate. About that complaint about the Jones Act that was not entirely accurate. I just can't quite remember what it is off the top of my head. It's been a while since then. Let's see. Are we doing okay? We started at what, 12:30?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, just let me know. Let's see. Also, speaking of history and wars, what do you make of Operation Barbarossa? A lot of people like to meme about it and say that Hitler shouldn't have invaded in the winter, but the operation started in June. What went wrong for the Germans? Oh boy, my dream came true. Yeah, we've talked about this before, haven't we, Neuro?
I think so, yeah.
I think it's some length. Yeah, let me see if I can remember. It's been a while. Let me see if I can get my motor running here. What do you make of Operation Barbarossa? That's a very broad question. So I'll skip to the second part and then get back to the first part there. Germans should not have invaded in the winter. They didn't invade in the winter, they invaded in the spring. The issue is not that they invaded in the winter. The issue is more that they were not prepared for winter. The German government and military thought that the war would be over before winter hit. And so German troops were not supplied with winter gear. And the Russian winter is of course pretty gnarly. It's very cold. So if you don't have the proper winter gear, a lot of trouble. It didn't really help them that they weren't entirely prepared for a major war at the time. Technically, I think the German military was sort of planning for a war in 1944, but then they kind of had to start early because Hitler saw some opportunity in specifically France. You know, they wanted to move on France after they signed the non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. So they started World War II a little bit early, and as a result, they weren't really fighting with their full capacity in 1941. They were Germany was not on a total war footing in World War II until 1942, I think, late 42 thereabouts. So for the first couple years of the war, 39, 40, 41, they were, in a sense, they were kind of fighting with one hand tied behind their back because they were not mobilized to the same degree as some of the nations they were fighting. And their industry was also still scaling up. They had not kind of completely recovered from the disarmament requirements that had been imposed on them by the Treaty of Versailles. They were still sort of rebuilding and rearming. They were making big progress, and they were, their military was well ahead of the well ahead of the British and French, by the time the war started. But invading the Soviet Union was probably a bit much. I think the Soviets knew that too, because I think from what I read, I remember reading that the Soviets were preparing for war in 1942, is what they were assuming. I know a lot of people say that Stalin didn't think that the Germans were going to go to war. Well, that's not entirely accurate. It would be more accurate to say that the Soviets and Stalin didn't think there would be a war in 41. They had a big military reorganization in the works, and they were trying to upgrade their equipment. They were trying to reorganize their military units so that they were more, how should I say, more mechanized, I guess, basically. And it was pretty much in the middle of that process when the Germans invaded. That was particularly inopportune timing. I think I read, I think it was a journalist who wrote a book about the Eastern Front, and he was writing that if the Germans had invaded a year earlier or a year later, they wouldn't have made nearly as much progress in the first year as they did. A year earlier, and the Germans wouldn't have been as prepared as they were in 41. And a year later, in 42, the Soviets would have had their military reorganization completed, and they would have been much more prepared. Keep in mind also, when the Germans invaded in June 41, they were not running into the Soviets' top defensive line. The Soviets had built a Stalin line, what was called the Stalin line by the international media. It's just a network of fortifications on the western border of the Soviet Union in anticipation of a conflict. They kind of figured that one would happen sooner or later. And the problem was that the Soviets, in conjunction with the Germans, divided Poland, and so the western frontier was pushed westward beyond the Stalin line. And the Soviets were still building new defensive works on the new border in their conquered Polish territory when the Germans invaded. So the Germans were not punching into sort of the cutting edge of Soviet defenses. They hadn't had as much time to prepare that frontier defense as they'd had to prepare defenses along the Stalin line. And they'd also basically front-loaded that whole frontier region with nothing but conscripts. So those were not their best troops out there in Poland. They did a lot better in the south, sort of in the frontier that they had sort of pre-existing fortifications. That was more along Moldova and the western Ukraine. And it's Army Group South, that's the German Army Group South, did not make nearly as much progress in the first couple months in the Ukraine as Army Group Center and North, because they got hung up in defensive fortifications, and they also got hung up on the rivers. There's a lot of north-south rivers in that region, and those were natural defensive barriers that the Soviets were able to use to good effect. Also, the southern region in Ukraine is the region where the Soviets had most of their armor located, most of their tanks. The Soviets actually had thousands and thousands of tanks at the start of the war. They were just all mostly garbage. They were all basically obsolete stuff from the 1920s and 30s. Except, of course, for the T-34, and that's another thing. Besides just having lots of tanks to throw at the Germans in the south, they also had a lot more T-34s in the south. And for those of you who are not familiar with the wonder that was the T-34 was probably the best, if or at least one of the best medium tanks in World War II, and it was very advanced for its time. The Germans were shocked that they had such an advanced tank. It had a lot of features like sloped armor, broad treads, and a main gun that was 75 millimeters, basically. I believe it was 75 millimeters at the time. Maybe that was later. I want to say it was a 75 millimeter main gun. That's important because at that time, tanks did not really have big main guns. That was pretty unusual. The tanks that Germany used to invade France, those were, I think, mostly Panzer IIs and I want to say Panzer IIIs. The main guns on those were generally like 25 millimeter, maybe 35, 40 millimeter, kind of more in that range. So to have a tank with a big 75 millimeter cannon, that was new. That was, I mean, I'm sure somebody had done it before, but that was a mainline tank, and nobody had really mass-produced tanks like that. I hope maybe I'm driving some military historian in chat crazy. Please correct me if I'm wrong. I don't want it. If I'm wrong, I want to know. But that is my impression. By the way, sloped armor is important because that makes. Normally, if you want armor to be tough, you want it to just be thick. But the innovation with sloped armor is that it deflects the force of anti-tank round, and so either the round doesn't do as much damage or it's deflected completely. And that actually happened in the first year of the war. German anti-tank guns and German tanks as well, would fire on T-34s, and they would actually watch the rounds bounce off. And the fact that they were able to beat them at all had to do with, one, superior training. The Soviet troops were not well trained at that time. And it also had to do with good training on the part of the Germans, so they were able to outmaneuver the T-34s, hit them on the side or in the rear where the armor was weaker. It also didn't help that the Soviet officer corps had been decimated in the purges in the late 30s. So a lot of Soviet military leaders were just not really up to snuff. A lot of them were young, green, inexperienced, and they just didn't really know what they're doing. There's a lot of stories of guys who would just frontally attack, like full stop, which is not really what you want to do, right? You want to kind of find avenues where you can catch the opponent by surprise. Don't do what they would expect. Don't hit them at their strongest point. But that's what a lot of people would do, just out of inexperience. They just weren't well trained enough. They would get the order to attack, and so then they would just send their people in, and they'd just get chewed up. I think I also remember reading about Russian tactics during the war. Russian infantry tactics were not great. They didn't really leverage the advantage in manpower very well. I think what they would do is that they would spread their infantry thin across a front. During an attack, they would spread the infantry across the area they were attacking. And the idea was that and then they would have reinforcements behind them. And the idea was that if any one of those attacking forces found a weak spot and made a breakthrough, then you could just jam those reinforcements in. But instead, the effect was basically to make the attack weak everywhere instead of strong in a single point, which would have made a breakthrough more likely. And so the Russians took a lot more casualties than they would have otherwise because they kind of did that. They were just spread a little more. They were spread too thin to really make the kind of impact that they should have. And that also had to do with inexperience, and I think that kind of changed as the war went along. The Red Army basically learned how to fight from scratch the hardest way you possibly could, which is fighting one of the most efficient military machines in the history of warfare, that being the Wehrmacht. Pretty impressive that they were able to pull it off. First year pretty ugly, but by the end they were definitely pulling it together. It's kind of going off on a tangent now, but yeah, those are all reasons that things were ugly in the first year, and it didn't really have to do with just fighting in winter. There were, well, I guess that doesn't. Let me start over. They didn't invade in winter. That wasn't the problem. The problem is they just weren't prepared for winter. So let's go with that.
Please take all necessary precautions when going outside if it is chilly. Thank you.
Yeah, there's a lot more you could get into that. One of the problems too is that the invasion actually got delayed by a month. They were actually going to invade, what was it, June? So it must have been May. They were originally going to invade in May, but then Mussolini needed help in Albania. He tried to invade Greece from Albania, and then the Greeks started winning the war. It looked like he was going to possibly lose Albania, so the Germans had to delay the invasion to go divert troops down into Greece, to invade Greece. And that was also around the time that there was a coup in Yugoslavia. There had been a pro-Axis government in Yugoslavia, but then there was a monarchist coup, and the monarch was pro-Allies. pro-British. And that wasn't really workable, so the Germans just kind of invaded Yugoslavia on the way to Greece, basically. That's a gross simplification, I know, but basically invading Yugoslavia and Greece delayed the invasion of the Soviet Union. And later on, once the invasion got going, there was kind of a point, I think it was a couple months in, after the Battle of Smolensk, when there was a sort of critical strategic decision that was made. And the decision was, after the Battle of Smolensk, do you push on Moscow, or do you divert troops from Army Group Center into the other army groups to try to help them catch up? And the leader of, I think the leader of the main Panzer Army in Army Group Center was a guy named Guderian. And Guderian very much wanted to push on Moscow. And Hitler basically told him no, because he thought, one, that it would be more important to try to take Leningrad, because at that point Leningrad was still holding out. And two, he wanted to try to help Army Group South catch up with Army Group Center. Like I was talking about before, Army Group Center did not make as much progress as the other two army groups. And the result is that there was kind of an overhang in the front. Army Group Center was much more forward, much more advanced into Soviet territory than Army Group South. And so Army Group Center's right flank was exposed. And there was concern in German high command that that flank could be attacked by the Soviets and maybe roll up Army Group Center. And Army Group South, in turn, in order to kind of negate that, it was thought needed to kind of push faster. And so the logic went, let's divert Army Group Center forces to the south to help them even out those lines, basically. And so ultimately, that's what they did. There's, I think, 2 Panzer armies were diverted. One went up to Leningrad, and then one went south and participated in the battle for Kiev and the battle of Uman, I think it was. Basically encircled them. The army group, the Panzergruppen from Army Group Center moved south and sort of surrounded Kiev from the east, and then Army Group Center pushed ahead and sort of met them around Kiev. And I think it was something like 600,000 to 700,000 Soviet troops ended up being caught in this Kiev garrison and ended up surrendering. Pretty huge, massive defeat for the Soviets at the time. But the point is, that created a delay. So Army Group Center made some progress towards Moscow, but because they didn't have those Panzergruppen, they didn't make nearly as much progress as they might have otherwise. And some people argue that that cost the Germans the war, because the argument, the impossible counterfactual is that those 2 Panzer armies could have been focused on Moscow, and the Soviets would not have had as much time as they ended up having to prepare defenses. So it would have been much weaker defenses there defending Moscow. But then the counter argument is that, yes, that's true, but 2 Panzer armies might not have been enough. They were well advanced of the rest of the German forces. Army Group South was still far behind. And the infantry probably would have been well behind the Panzer armies as well. So yes, weaker Soviet defenses, but also a weaker German attack. So it's not inevitable that if they pushed on Moscow, and I think it was August or September of 41, that they would have inevitably gotten it and maybe won. But that is kind of considered a critical moment. And so some people argue that maybe that cost them Moscow. And so the point of all this is, I'm just illustrating all these different delays added up to the German expectation that they would not have to fight in winter being proven false. That's sort of the takeaway there. There was all these delays, and it ended up pushing the combat into winter, and that's when they really got hurt. They didn't get hurt as much as they could have. It was thought that there might be a rout. The initial Soviet counteroffensive, the winter counteroffensive, was so powerful that it kind of looked like the German army might be utterly destroyed. And in one of his few moments, as one of his few good calls, Hitler actually ordered all German units to just hold their position. And he was kind of credited for contributing to the saving of the German army at the Eastern Front at the time, because that prevented the German army from just retreating in complete disorganization. It would have been a big mess if they had continued to retreat. Ended up being a bit of a mess anyway. There was a lot of guerrilla warfare behind German lines at the time because of Soviet guerrillas and paratroops who launched an offensive coordinated with the winter counteroffensive. So for a while there basically was no front line in front of Moscow. It was just everybody fighting everybody in this big disorganized melee, but the Germans were able to hold out. long enough to kind of hold their positions, and so that ended up being where the lines were drawn for the next year, for the spring fighting. Yeah, you could kind of go further, but I'm assuming the question is more focused on 41. I'm sure there's more to it. I just can't remember it all off the top of my head. You know, for those of you who really are interested in the Eastern Front, you know, it's a fascinating topic. There's a really good Russian documentary series. I think it's called Red Storm. Let me see if I can look that up real quick. World War II doc. There's not a lot of Western documentaries about the Eastern Front. There's a few, but they're not really all that great. And a lot of them use old source material. So it was really cool to see a Russian series kind of finally be translated into English. That's pretty good. Soviet Storm. Soviet Storm World War II, that's what it's called. And I think it's all on YouTube. So for those interested, definitely check those out. Those are pretty cool. And they've even got some episodes on some stuff that doesn't get nearly as much attention, like the Battle of the Caucasus. You know, everybody knows about the Battle of Stalingrad, but at the same time Stalingrad was happening, there was also a German push into the Caucasus to try to take Soviets' main oil center, you know, sort of in that southern Caucasus region. And that was a whole battle in and of itself. It was originally supposed to be the main objective. In the 1942, I think it was Plan Blue. That was the name of the big German summer offensive in 42. The original main objective was to take the Caucasus and the oil fields. But then they got sidetracked by Stalingrad. You know, securing the city of Stalingrad was just meant to be the sort of side operation to secure the flank of the main force pushing into the south into the Caucasus. But when it became apparent that the Soviets were going to fight hard to try to keep the city, Hitler and some of the high command thought that that would be their opportunity to try to catch the Red Army in a big set-piece battle. You know, one of the big German objectives from the start of the war was to try to stop the Soviets from just retreating into Russia. They wanted to try to force the Red Army to fight so that they could crush the Red Army and get a decisive military defeat. And the thing they didn't want is for the war to just get delayed by continual Russian retreating, because they were afraid that would lead to what happened in 41, basically, having to fight in winter and dragging out the conflict, which they didn't think they could win, which ended up being right. So they thought that if the Red Army would fight in Stalingrad, that was sort of their opportunity to force a battle that they could win and crush the back of the Red Army. And that's when they sort of shifted strategy away from the Caucasus and towards Stalingrad. They actually did that a couple times. The original plan ended up being changed, I think, 2 or 3 separate times, sort of as a part of different perceived opportunities emerging. But the result is that the Battle of the Caucasus isn't really remembered that much. It ended up kind of being secondary to the larger battle in Stalingrad. So they've got an episode on the Caucasus, and they've got an episode, I think, on air combat, naval combat, lots of cool stuff that you can't really get in Western documentaries. So definitely check that out. Highly recommended. Let's see. I guess I'll stop there. It's a fun question for me because that's an old hobby. But I think I've addressed the question. What do you make of Operation Barbarossa? Right, that was the first part of the question. Well, I mean, I think it was something that the German government, specifically Hitler, really wanted to do because they wanted to secure their eastern flank. They didn't really trust the Soviets, and you know that was mutual. The Soviets didn't trust the Germans either. So it was probably inevitable. But at the same time, I think they probably could have been better prepared for it. But I guess the counter-argument there would be that so would the Russians then, you know. If you take more time to prepare yourself, that gives your opponent also more time to prepare. And everybody was definitely doing that, you know, everybody was scaling up their militaries. So, yeah, I don't know that it was really... One of the criticisms I've read is that it was never a that Germany could have realistically won. Which is interesting because, you know, obviously there's a lot of fanboys, World War II, you know, aficionados, if you like, who kind of treat the Eastern Front as a near thing, you know, something the Germans almost won. But maybe that's not entirely accurate. You know, some of the criticism is that actually it was never a realistic possibility. And I've even read There was a guy I read back in the day. I think that was Overy, one of Overy's books. And he was saying that even without Lend-Lease or the Western Front, that the Soviets probably could have fought them to a standstill, a stalemate. Not necessarily a successful defeat of Germany, but they could have fought them to a standstill at least. And that's predicated on, Soviet industry picking up and whatnot. Soviet industry really got gutted in the first year, and it took them about a year to move it all east and to set it up again. But once they did in 1942, the Soviet war economy really kind of picked up, and they were able to make a lot of headway. So, even without a lot of Lend-Lease, they probably could have made a pretty decent showing for themselves. Debatable, I know, but that's the argument made. But certainly, certainly with the Allies helping with Lend-Lease and the Western Front, fighting in Italy and France and whatnot, the Germans just never really had the resources to do that. Certainly not over a long, drawn-out conflict. There's a reason the Germans went for the quick knockout victories, in France, the Netherlands, etc., and Russia. A protracted conflict was never going to be feasible because they just didn't have the natural resources. They didn't have the kind of oil resources and whatnot that would be needed for a long war. And once the Soviets were able to drag that out, it made it pretty much inevitable that they would run dry at some point, which is basically what happened. So probably inevitable, and probably inevitable that it was not going to end well for Germany. It was probably a dumb idea from the start. I might add here that German intelligence was really bad from the start as well. The Gestapo just did not have a realistic understanding and reading of Soviet military capabilities, Soviet industry. The expectation is that it would be a repeat of World War I, where Russian armies underperformed and kind of collapsed under pressure. When confronted with German armies. Didn't always happen that way, I know, but it happened enough to create a perception amongst Germans that the Russian army was not a match for the German army. And so it was kind of expected that the Russian army would implode again. It was also thought that communism and communist economic policies had gutted Soviet industry and that the Soviet economy would not be able to match German industry. And that obviously ended up being very false. So there was just some very unrealistic assumptions being made at a strategic level as far as planning the war. Okay, so that's... I think we've kind of covered that. If you want to ask, if I missed the point of the question, this goes for anybody. If I ever miss the point of a question, or if you want to kind of elaborate on it, please do feel free to ask again, and I'm kind of happy to return to it. There's been discussion, next question, there's been discussion lately that capitalism is fundamentally incompatible with democracy. The argument is that a firm which is growing in size will eventually reach a point where the next dollar it could spend on R&D will generate a lower return than spending that same dollar on lobbying for special treatment, raising barriers to competition, etc. And if that firm won't do lobbying, it will tend to be outcompeted by other firms with lower ethical standards. Therefore, the argument goes, there is an inexorable trend towards corruption of democracy. What's your take on this argument? I mean, to a degree, that's just describing the natural life cycle of a product. Any industry will sort of start out as an infant industry. It'll develop, it'll evolve. It'll become more competitive with time. And then eventually it'll mature and it'll kind of be... producers will exit the market and it'll kind of attract less and less investment as the product in question kind of becomes cheaper and less valuable and is mass produced to a point where it's not really of interest to investors. So that's sort of the natural life cycle of a company, if I'm remembering it correctly anyway. And yeah, to a degree, you could argue that once you reach that mature stage, when you sort of reach a point of diminishing returns on investment, diminishing profits and whatnot, there is that temptation to lobby to try to bolster profits and to try to kind of goose profits in a sort of effort to maintain revenue. But, I think ultimately economic pressure wins the day on that. Even if you have lobbying on your side, you can't really change that fundamental economic calculus. And yes, you could arguably implement some kind of monopoly if you have enough lobbying power, more specifically, if you have enough people in government who are willing to pass regulatory policies that have that effect. But in that case, that's not a question of capitalism, that's a question of governance and civil society. You know, if you have good governance, good strong institutions, a solid political culture, and a strong civil society, that doesn't generally end up being too much of a problem. It still happens. I'm not going to say here that capitalism doesn't have problematic aspects in that regard, but you know, you could say that about, you would still say that in any other system, and in this system, you could say that about other aspects of liberal democracy beyond just firms. You know, you could say that about activist groups, NGOs, etc. You know, any kind of interest group is going to have the power to influence government. So I don't know that that's necessarily a flaw per se. That's just an inherent part of having a democracy. You know, business owners, corporations, etc. Those are all people and citizens too, and they have as much of a right to lobby as anybody.
Corporations are people, my friend.
Technically, they are.
Mitt Romney. One aspect of this discussion that I think bears mentioning that also ties it back to gaming a little bit is the nature of having a nation and how systems, like using the broad terms like socialism, capitalism, stuff like that, you also have to factor in things like just throughput of economy and military so that you're able to defend yourself. We've had a lot of major wars and stuff, and there is that quest for the most representative and fair type of government, but there's also, like we've talked about in some previous episodes, the reaction speed of a government and their military to be able to respond to threats. Because you may have a beautiful, peaceful, science-based society, but if there's a militaristic country that rolls through and just destroys you, then, well, game over. So it's kind of like trying to find the balance between survival and optimization for the citizens of your country. If you just go all in for one of those, then you present a weakness for yourself. In the 21st century, we have some unique opportunities, like Costa Rica as an example, where it's like, yep, we don't have a military anymore. We don't need one. Historically speaking, that would have just been like, well, okay, well then someone's gonna come in and take all your stuff and you're toast. So these are new and fun questions we get to ask, but a lot of the kind of life cycle of what different forms of government have been more successful than others are based on those more early game and mid game factors in nation building.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, corruption amongst firms trying to get favors from government, that's been a problem for as long as there's been government. And the degree to which it's a problem is a function of civil society and governance. That would be my argumentation. So yes, capitalism does technically contribute to that, but that's an overarching, just inherent systemic issue. And you know, if you want to make a critique of capitalism and argue it would be better to change it, you can make that argument, but I think that's separate. I think that would be a different argument than saying firms are lobbying government, and is that a problem? Kind of, but again, they have a right to lobby, and it's the job of an engaged democratic civil society to be aware of that and to counter it with, or you know, bolster it depending on one's perspective, corresponding with their own interests. Let's see. I hope I'm getting, I hope I'm understanding this argument right. If not, kind of point out what I'm missing, and I can kind of come back to it. And well, I mean the question specifically. I hope I'm understanding the question correctly. If not, kind of point out what I'm missing here, and I'll be happy to get back to it. Let's see. Do you follow the political situation in Burma? What are your thoughts on the effectiveness of Aung San Suu Kyi's political party in pushing for a continuing democratic transition for Burma? The next election is coming up, and there is a general view that the military government might again control because of dissatisfaction for the slow economic growth promised by her party. I haven't heard much news from Burma lately. It's been almost all Rohingya stuff for the past few years. I've been following it, I've been following the Rohingya drama, and I've been following Aung Suu Kyi a little bit. but I haven't really been following the Burmese economy much, or Myanmar economy, or whatever. Technically, it's supposed to be Myanmar, but a lot of people still call it Burma, since that's what it used to be called before the military government changed it. I mean, the military government is going to have a lot of power after the next election, regardless, because they wrote the Constitution such to include, I think, 25% of the seats in the legislature are appointed by the military. So, you know, they're going to have a pretty strong showing, regardless. But there was sufficient support for Aung Suu Kyi's Democratic Party that they ended up winning, like, all of the rest of the seats in the previous election. They basically swept all of the seats that were not appointed by the military. Pretty impressive showing. So, yeah, it would not surprise me if they lost seats, because they kind of have nowhere to go but down at this point. And after a couple years of governance, it would be understandable if there was some discontent, some disenchantment for whatever, you know, for perceived failings on the part of the government to deliver on promises for further democratization or further economic reform. But I don't know that there's so much disaffection that they're really just going to get gutted in the next election. You know, I do know one of the things the military is doing is they're trying to support Buddhist extremist candidates. And yes, there are such things as Buddhist extremists, if you can believe that. The idea is that Buddhist extremists are going to be more in line with the military. And, you know, probably they've got some kind of quid pro quo arrangement that's not really that we don't really know about. You know, the military is probably giving them financial support in exchange for political support. So if they do pick up seats, that'll probably de facto expand the military's power. That's been more the vector they've been using to try to undermine Aung Suu Kyi's Democratic Party. But beyond that, I don't know how much more disaffection there is with the state of the economy and how much more seats they might lose. I know some nationalists are pretty upset about the way the Rohingya thing was handled. A lot of nationalists believe that Aung Suu Kyi kind of caved into international pressure too much and didn't stand up for the Burmese perspective, so to speak, on the Rohingya issue. And of course, that's part of the catch-22 Aung Suu Kyi was in. You know, on the one hand, if she doesn't do enough about the Rohingya issue, the international community turns on her, and she loses international support. But then if she does too much about it, then she loses domestic support, and the whole democratization project that she's been leading kind of gets put in danger. So damned if she does, damned if she doesn't, so to speak. Let's see. So that's pretty much as much as I could say on it without kind of looking into the Burmese economy more. I'll stick that in my. I'll open a tab for that. And elections, because I haven't read anything in the news about it lately. But that is my perspective from what I know and from what I've read. Could you give a quick summary of the recent conflicts in Kashmir? I think we covered that last week. Oh, the recent conflicts in Kashmir. Okay. So recently, actually, that was a big thing that happened this week. Did you hear about the World War III, Neuro?
Mm-mm.
Yeah, that was a big one. Almost a big one. It didn't end up being world. Some people were saying it would be, but that was never. Well, basically, I'll start with this question, and then I'll kind of lead into that. So basically, I mean, just a little background. Kashmir is the disputed territory that India and Pakistan claim. And so what happened, I think, a week or two ago, I guess, is that there was a suicide bombing that attacked an Indian patrol in Kashmir. There's a lot of insurgent activity in the Indian part of Kashmir. You know, the province of Kashmir is basically divided in roughly half. And the Pakistanis have one half and the Indians have another half. That's a gross simplification, but you know, just to simplify, that's sort of what it is. And so separatists, people in the Indian Kashmir who want Kashmir to be a part of Pakistan, have been fighting an off-and-on insurgency for the past, 30-some years, I think it was. And it's been less violent for the past few years, but there's been a lot of political unrest by protesters, people who are angry about the excessive presence of the Indian military and security institutions in Kashmir. Because of the insurgency, there's a huge number of Indian troops deployed in Kashmir, and they have basically uh, emergency powers in Kashmir. There's basically martial law there, and so the army can kind of not do whatever it wants, but they have a lot of discretionary decision-making power, and sometimes that gets abused, with the result that the population gets even more alienated. So again, 2 weeks ago, there was a suicide bombing that attacked a patrol uh, in Kashmir, and then there was a big hue and cry about it because India believes that a lot of the insurgents in Kashmir are supported by Pakistan, and that the Pakistanis are trying to support those insurgents so that they can overthrow the government and get Kashmir in as part of Pakistan. Now, what happened this past week, as a result of that, is that India retaliated, because there's been terrorist attacks in Kashmir and even the rest of India before that are known to have been supported by Pakistan. Uh, and so there's been a big push for the Indian government to be more forceful in responding to those, to try to deter the Pakistani state from supporting terrorists and rebel groups. And so Narendra Modi is more of a nationalist politician. He's the prime minister of India right now, and his BJP party is known for being very nationalist and conservative. So they, in particular, were feeling the heat to try to have a strong response to this. And they responded by launching an airstrike into Pakistan, which was a big deal because it's not unheard of for there to be airstrikes in, say, Kashmir. That would be a serious escalation in and of itself. But in this case, they didn't just they went into proper Pakistani territory. I guess I should elaborate here. The Pakistani part of Kashmir, the part that's held by Pakistan, is not technically part of Pakistan. It's actually technically an independent state called, I think, Azad Kashmir, which is basically free Kashmir. And it's basically part of Pakistan, and the government is kind of beholden to Pakistan. The Pakistani government kind of treats it like a province, in that they give them money for, infrastructure and stuff like that. But technically, it's an independent state. So the Indian airstrike actually occurred not in Azad Kashmir. It actually occurred slightly beyond Azad Kashmir into the actual proper territory of Pakistan. And nominally, they supposedly struck a terrorist group. I think it's the one that they blamed for the suicide bombing. JEM is the acronym. I forget what it stands for exactly. It's like Jaish-e-Muhammad or something to that effect. And that airstrike caught the Pakistanis off guard. And so they retaliated to the airstrike by launching an airstrike into Indian Kashmir. And it's not really clear what they struck, if anything. They made it really clear in public statements that they did not attack any military targets. They did not attack the Indian military. That would have been a very severe escalation. But if not that, then it's not clear what else. It was probably infrastructure or something like that. But it hasn't really come out yet just what. But basically, the Pakistanis launched an airstrike, and then the Indian Air Force responded, and there was a dogfight of some kind. It's not exactly clear. The details of all this are still kind of coming out. Both the Pakistani and Indian state are kind of notorious for withholding information on incidents like this. But the Pakistani Air Force then shot down 2 Indian aircraft. One of them crashed in Kashmir, one of them crashed in Pakistan. And they were actually able to capture the pilot of that crashed aircraft. And so then there was kind of a bit of a standoff over, all right, well, will they give back the Indian pilot and whatnot? And will there be further escalation? And that's a problem because both India and Pakistan have nuclear weapons. So there was a prospect of escalatory spiral into nuclear war. But I think both Pakistan and India kind of managed it relatively well. Obviously, it would have been better if they didn't have airstrikes. Nuclear powers launching airstrikes into each other's territory is pretty unprecedented. That's not really considered good policy. But if you do have to do that, if you do have to do something like that, they did it relatively well. The Indians made it clear that they were attacking the terrorist group. It wasn't really deep into Pakistani territory. They were not attacking the Pakistani military. And the Pakistani response, again, very explicitly did not attack the Indian military. So these are very limited airstrikes with limited goals. And as a result, they were able to kind of prevent that escalatory spiral. And also, the Pakistanis kind of just handing over the pilot helped. That also was kind of a signal of good faith. So I think mostly the airstrikes were for show. I think mostly it was just keep in mind there's an election coming up in India. So the Modi administration is kind of particularly feeling the pressure to try to show that it's strong on national defense. And then on the Pakistani side, also pretty much for show. I mean, whether or not they were behind the suicide bombing or not, debatable. Probably gave the group some support, but not clear that they were explicitly trying to get them to launch a suicide attack like that at that particular time. Regardless, it's ambiguous, and I think the Pakistani military, which is basically the institution in Pakistan that's in charge of Pakistan's foreign policy, I think they were more interested in just trying to look good, maintain their status as the premier institution in Pakistan. I don't know how many people follow Pakistani politics, but basically the story since Pakistan's independence has been a constant struggle between civil institutions and the Pakistani military, which as an institution is much stronger than civil institutions. And the result is that the Pakistani military kind of basically bosses around the civil institutions. The prime minister of Pakistan right now is a guy named Sharif, I think is. He's a former cricket player. He's not really he's not the real power behind the Pakistani government. So when the media kind of went to him to ask him what he thought about the Indian airstrikes and what he would do about it, it didn't really matter what he said because it was never really his decision. It was always going to be the Pakistani military's decision. They were the real decision makers there. And, from their perspective, they just wanted to establish deterrence. You can't launch an airstrike in our territory without a response. But beyond that, they were not interested in launching a further escalation. And again, neither were the Indians. So basically, we witnessed some really high stakes theater in the subcontinent over the past week. Pretty interesting game theory. Fortunately, it didn't go beyond that, and everything kind of went to plan, so to speak. There weren't any surprises. So, no risk, or at least no greater risk than that which was already taken. But that's basically a quick summary of the recent events in Kashmir. Let me check my notes real quick, because I did have some stuff on that. Here we go. Yeah, I think I covered all that. Yeah, this isn't entirely unprecedented because there was a similar incident a couple, I want to say months ago, maybe it was last year, and there was a similar terrorist attack in Kashmir, or separatist attack, or freedom fighter attack, or whatever your preferred framing is for that. And the Indian response was to launch an airstrike into Pakistani Kashmir, Azad Kashmir. And I don't think the Pakistanis responded then, which is actually why I was surprised they responded this time. The Pakistanis did not retaliate to that particular Indian airstrike. So this has happened before, but this is the first time the Indians have struck Pakistani territory, and it's the first time the Pakistanis have in turn launched an airstrike in retaliation. That's relatively new, I think, as far as my understanding. Okay. So next question, thoughts on the GOP and establishment Democrats weaponizing any criticism of Israel by mischaracterizing it as anti-Semitic? Well, this is sort of this is an old criticism of Israel and sort of the way it frames the conflict in Palestine. The criticism is that they accuse people who are anti-Zionist or against the occupation of being anti-Semitic.
Oh, right. Yeah, I see what you're saying. It was kind of confusing with the way it was phrased.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, you have people in the U.S. who are either pro-Israel or pro-Palestine, and people who are pro-Palestine and against Zionism. They'll say, you're being anti-Semitic. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think it's something that the Republicans are particularly guilty of. That's more something that comes out of Israel in particular and some Israel supporters. Keep in mind the Republican Party is not monolithically pro-Israel. In general, they tend to be, because evangelicals tend to be very pro-Israel for religious reasons, as you've talked about before, Neuro.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also national security conservatives who kind of support Israel, who generally support Israel. But beyond that, there's also an anti-interventionist libertarian wing to that's pretty critical. It doesn't like the fact that Israel is so important in U.S. foreign policy. And there are Democrats who kind of do that too for similar reasons, but again, not monolithic. There's pro and anti-Israeli Israel wings of the Democratic Party. Yeah, I mean, it's just it's a rhetorical tactic. It's kind of cheap. Because I don't think it's fair to say somebody who opposes the occupation in the Palestinian territories, or someone who's critical of certain Israeli policies in Israel, even. I don't think it's fair to say those people are innately anti-Semitic for doing so. I think the problem partly is that there are legitimate anti-Semites who also oppose those policies and criticize Israel for the occupation. And so that kind of gives the Israelis and Israeli supporters sort of some space to make the accusation.
Yeah, one of the aspects of this too is it's not just what Israel is trying to do by have a state for itself, but it's how you're going about that with the people who are already in the region. And if you're forcing people out of their homes and places they've lived for a long time, that's generally frowned upon. But finding a nation of people who are Israeli, Jewish, seems like an endeavor that most people would kind of identify as something that you should be able to do. See, the Kurds. Poor Kurds.
Yeah, nation building is, well, not nation per se, but carving out nations is always going to be controversial. The two big partitions of the mid-20th century were South Asia and Palestine, carving Israel and Palestine out of the old Palestinian Mandate, and then carving India and Pakistan out of the old British Indian territory. Neither of those have particularly gone well. Probably could have been managed better, but it is what it is. And certainly you can make an argument that the Jews who lived in the Palestinian Mandate territory deserved their own state. Given the hostilities at the time, that's a whole other conversation. It's a very long, laborious conversation because there's a lot of history there.
Well, that's one of those things where it's like, can you comment on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? It's like, how many millennia back do you want to go?
Yeah, there's a lot of meat to that. But basically, yeah, I do think that accusations of anti-Semitism do tend to be, sometimes, I should say that, they are sometimes thrown around rather glibly as a counter-argument to criticism of Israel. That does happen. But I don't think it's an institutional thing. I don't think the Republican or Democratic parties do that as a whole. I just think supporters of Israel will do that sometimes. Not everybody who supports Israel runs around criticizing all of their opponents as anti-Semites. There's a lot of good faith, legitimate debate that happens there. I might add that the Israeli lobby in Washington is not nearly as powerful as it used to be. There's been a big fracturing in the Jewish community in the United States between people who are pro and anti-occupation, and that's kind of watered down the lobbying power of AIPAC. I think that's what it's called. That's the lobby. I think that's the name. I think that's the name of the big lobbying group that's pro-Israel in Washington. So they don't really have quite the same support amongst Jewish voters in the United States that they used to, and so they don't quite have the same pull. Also, they lost a lot of weight during the Obama administration because, again, like I was saying before, the Obama administration kind of withdrew from the Middle East and Middle Eastern politics a bit, at least in so much as that was possible. And the result is that Israel ended up kind of with less political influence than it would have had that it had previously. let's see. What do you think of Timber Sycamore? Do you think it was a bad idea? And this was the weapons program to support Syrian rebels, I think. Still need to read more about that. I did read a little bit. I think somebody asked about this before. And I didn't have as much to say about it before. From what little I have read about it, I don't know that it was a bad idea per se. I mean, really, the discussion there is not about whether supplying weapons to rebels was a bad idea. The discussion is more about what should America's role in the Syrian conflict have been. And you can say it should not have had a role, you could say it should have done more, you could say it should have done things differently, etc. But I think that's the more relevant overarching debate there, as opposed to the specific happenings of Timber Sycamore. I mean, at the time, the Obama administration just didn't really know what it wanted to do. And I think nobody in the U.S. really had any kind of consensus about what the proper response to the Syrian civil war should be. I mean, America's allies in the region kind of just went ahead. Like I was saying before, the Obama administration's approach to regional affairs was to let regional allies take care of their own business, and the U.S. would be a kind of protector of last resort, an offshore balancer to a degree. But then, of course, that implied that the Saudis could go, and the Turks for that matter, Turkey and Saudi Arabia could kind of just go out and have misadventures. And one of them was Syria. They jumped into the Syrian civil war with gusto. And because the United States was not really involved in it, we didn't really have a lot of leverage that we could kind of bring to bear to influence what they did in it. We could have brought some leverage to bear economically, diplomatically, to try to stop them from intervening in the first place. But given that the U.S. was trying to get less involved in regional affairs, that kind of ran counter to that. You can't pull out of the region and then still tell people what to do. It's a little counterintuitive. Maybe they could have done it if they'd tried harder. Again, debatable. But they didn't. So we kind of ended up with a sort of half-in, half-out Syria policy. We're helping our allies somewhat in Syria, but we don't really like the Syrian opposition. We don't like the Islamist rebels. So we're not really going to help a lot. It's not going to be helping enough to really make a difference. It's more like token help, basically. And so, in that sense, yeah, that was a bad idea. Token interventions are never a good idea. If you're going to do it, do it. If you're not going to do it, then don't. But don't half-ass it. And I kind of feel like the Syrian intervention, for at least the U.S. involvement in the Syrian civil war, was kind of half-assed. Wasn't really fully thought out in that sense. It seemed like American policies vis-a-vis Syria were more path of least resistance decisions, as opposed to overarching grand plan. Here's our strategic interest. Here's how we want to object it, how we want to pursue them. Here's how we define the Syrian civil war in terms of those objectives, and then here's what we do about it. I don't get the sense that's what was really done. It seems like there was more of a bigger debate within the administration about how much to get involved and whether or not it was a good idea. And I think President Obama and some of his sort of inner council were very much opposed to intervention. We kind of saw that with the whole chemical weapons thing. And there were some people who did want intervention. That was kind of Samantha Powers as the head of the the humanitarian interventionist in the administration. I think the military was pretty mad about it. They didn't really want to get involved that much, but definitely the humanitarian interventionists were pretty gung-ho about it, but they kind of got outvoted, basically. So yeah, supplying weapons to the rebels in Syria, was it a good idea? And debatable. It just kind of depends on what you think about what America's role in the conflict should have been. Whether the degree to which the U.S. was involved in the Syrian civil war was effective, whether that was a good idea, I would argue not. I don't think that was. I don't think half-assing it was the way to go, because you're in enough to be culpable and to have a stake in it, but you're not in enough to really lead the effort or to have significant influence. So we kind of ended up with the worst of both worlds as a result. That's my argumentation. Make of that what you will. Obviously, everybody is going to have their own perception of the Syrian conflict and the U.S.'s role in it. Political preferences and whatnot in effect there. I won't tell you what to believe. That's not my bag. I'm not here to proselytize. I just try to describe things, try to give background information. And again, if I'm not doing a good job at that, please point it out. I want to know. I'm trying to get better at that over time, working at that. But that is kind of my impression of Timber Sycamore and U.S. involvement in Syria. For those interested in more, I have my first couple episodes in my podcast, which still technically exists, are about Syria. So I talk a lot about the countries involved in Syria and some of the background and whatnot. It's a little bit dated now. I guess it's a year old now, so this is probably not entirely up to date, but I think I give decent background info on it. So if you want more detail, you can kind of check that out and you might like it. Feedback is appreciated in that regard. It's not great audio since it's my first recording, so be merciful or be patient. You'd have to be to listen to me. I was having a hard time listening to it a couple of weeks ago. Let's see, are we doing okay on time?
Yeah, we could probably, I don't know if Strovemy is around, probably cut off questions and then go for another 15, 20.
Gotcha.
As you like. I'm good energy-wise. I'll probably go after the Agents segment and keep streaming, but yeah, it's been fun so far. There was someone who's saying, I don't get the American mindset of being involved in everything. So
Sorry, what was that?
I don't get the American mindset of wanting to be involved in everything. It kind of goes back to World War I or World War II, I think, and us trying to not intervene for as long as possible and then getting poked to the point where we do intervene. And because the U.S. was very far removed from a lot of the direct frontline fighting, we had the opportunity to build up our infrastructure really fast and build a really monstrous military-industrial complex. So just a huge war machine in the U.S. that cranked out a ton of material, tanks, trucks, all that kind of stuff. And because our infrastructure was less damaged during the wars, we just had really strong kind of resting power after that. So we kind of fancy ourselves the heroes. I mean, war is obviously terrible, but that's kind of the mindset is we saved World War II in a big way and have a huge army at the end of it. So we can kind of police other countries, and if someone's out of line, then we have the trucks and the planes and the guns and stuff to be able to intervene.
And I would elaborate on that with a little bit of context too. It was not originally envisioned that the U.S. would be world policeman after World War II. The original vision was that the UN Security Council nations would basically be responsible for security in their respective regions. So the U.S. in the Western Hemisphere, the British in the British Empire, the French in the French Empire, and the Soviets with Eastern Europe and Central Asia, and China with East Asia. That was sort of the original plan. And that didn't pan out because the British Empire collapsed, the French Empire collapsed, the Soviets were kind of not really good faith partners in the endeavor, shall we say. And China collapsed also, the Chinese Civil War, or at least became communist, which at the time was associated with being a puppet of the Soviet Union. So there was a sense that if there was to be world peace, then there would have to be an active United States in world affairs, because the British and the French were not really able to maintain security in their regions, and the Soviets were seen at the time as a hostile expansionist power that would, if presented with weakness on along its borders, would take the opportunity to expand, as expansionist powers are wont to do. Again, this is the perspective at the time. And so that being the perspective, it was seen as necessary for the United States to kind of fill the role that the British Empire had played in sort of policing the global commons, so to speak. So that's sort of the bureaucratic policy description of the reason for American interventionism. It was sort of birthed out of a sense of necessity, out of a sense that there would have to be some strong American role in the world to prevent further conflict in the vein that had happened in the 30s and 40s. Keep in mind, the Soviet Union at the time was not seen as being all that different from other totalitarian regimes that had emerged in the 1920s and 30s. You know, Mussolini's Italy, Nazi Germany, and any number of smaller dictatorships that emerged in Eastern Europe. You know, all of them were very violent, ideological, and expansionist. And I would emphasize expansionist in that. You know, everybody and their mother in Central and Eastern Europe after World War I was very expansionist. There was lots of conflicts between, you know, Poland, Germany, the Russians. I mean, there was a lot of fighting. And given that the Soviet Union was basically the same regime, basically the last man standing of all those authoritarian regimes, it was just kind of assumed that they still held on to that expansionist tendency, or that expansionist preference, rather. So that being the case, it was seen as necessary that the U.S. would be. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, to kind of sum up your point, you're basically saying that it wasn't just an infrastructure reason that the U.S. became world police. It was also that it had the greatest amount of stability post World War II, where there weren't like major kind of faction overturning things that caused it to be dealing with internal conflicts like the other members of the UN.
Yeah, we were in a much stronger position here in the U.S. The U.S. economy was very powerful. You know, kind of as you mentioned, we were in a good position and had the most powerful navy in the history of naval warfare at that point. So that helped a lot. But also, we were in a position to give a lot of aid and credit that Europe was not, or Japan for that matter. So partly out of necessity, and then I would also add the elaboration as far as this point. Not every American thinks that the U.S. should intervene in foreign affairs or likes that it does. And in fact, foreign intervention is very, very controversial in U.S. politics and is always a hot topic. So it's not really the case that all Americans think with that sort of interventionist mindset. It's very much a political discussion and debate that happens here that leads to those interventions.
Well, it's not even just split left and right either, because you have people on the left like Hillary Clinton who are more hawkish and people who are on the left who are more dovish. I think Bernie Sanders was less interventionist, and then the same thing on the right. Libertarians, for example, would be very much against intervention because intervention is incredibly expensive and they want to cut government spending pretty much at all costs.
Yeah. Yeah, they also tend to be a little more realist in their perspective of international relations, so they don't really like the United States getting entangled in foreign affairs or signing treaties. You know, that's another libertarian thing, is that they like national sovereignty. They see international treaties and agreements as infringing on the national sovereignty, so they tend to be a bit more opposed to those than others. Not always, you know, there's factions even there. But kind of in general, that's sort of the crux of libertarian conservative opposition to interventionism. And then, of course, there's the national security hawks and the Republican Party, who tend to be very pro-intervention. So, yeah, that's a very good point. It's very much a bipartisan thing. There's a lot of divides that run cross party lines in that vein, and have been for a very long time. You know, if the day ever comes when I finish this podcast series on the Rio Treaty, someday, the next one will probably be about NATO, and that's going to be a lot shorter. Oh God, will it ever be a lot shorter? And one of the things that happened in NATO is that there was a lot of opposition to it in the United States. And in fact, it was kind of the Europeans who were really lobbying more to get the U.S. to join NATO and get public support in the U.S. behind it. But there was so many people who were so skeptical about joining an international defense treaty like NATO in the U.S. just because of that residual isolationist sentiment. That was a political norm in the United States for, you know, decades, generations before that. And it didn't go away. It's still there. All through the Cold War, there was debates about whether the U.S. should be intervening here or there, should be involved in international security issues. And those debates continue today. So it's not really true that the U.S. ever fully embraced its status as an interventionist global policeman. It never really did. There's always been a strong undercurrent in U.S. politics against interventionism. But it's always been sublimated to overarching concerns with perceived threats like communism, or after the Cold War, to a lesser degree, terrorism. Communism was the big one during the Cold War, for sure. And there was enough people in the U.S. across party lines who saw the Soviets as enough of a threat to warrant continued U.S. interventions overseas, or continued U.S. involvement in world affairs. But there were definitely people who ran against it.
We don't usually state our political stance, and I think you tend to be basically as neutral as you can be. From my perspective, because a lot of people like just talking about that, I tend to be against intervention for the reason that we have talked about. In order for real change to happen in a country, the cultural norms need to change to the point where the people want that change, rather than just we swoop into a country, overthrow the regime that's in power, establish a new one, and say, okay, now this is how you establish democracy, and then just expect them to create a nation based on our playbook. That's very wishful thinking. We've tried to do that quite a few times. The flip side, that is kind of a feeling that you have, is if you have a really terrible leader in a country who's abusing the people of that country and they can't really do anything about it, is there a point where you should try to help with that? So it's very complicated, and I'm not an expert in this kind of thing at all, so it's kind of just the basic armchair general perspective.
Well, I think that's a good representation of perspective a lot of people have on the subject. You know, a lot of the countries that the U.S. ends up intervening in are not places that most people in the U.S. had ever heard of before the subject came up. You know, nobody really knew much about Iraq when the Gulf War happened. Nobody really knew much about Vietnam when the Vietnam War happened. It kind of comes out of the blue for the common people. You know, for policymakers in Washington, it doesn't. You know, there's kind of a lead up and there's policy debate there. But for everybody else, it's just sort of, oh, that's a thing now. And then they kind of hash out how they feel about it later. Yeah, if you want an example of conservative opposition to interventionism, I think Bosnia is a good example of that. The Bosnian Civil War was very violent, and the Europeans wanted to try to send peacekeepers, but they didn't really have enough military resources with which to do that. And so they asked the United States to come and do it, to help them do it, and the United States government basically said, why? Why are we getting involved in this? That was mostly conservative opposition that fed that. They saw no real security interest for the United States in the Balkans or Bosnia. So it took a lot of convincing and a lot of politicking to get sufficient congressional okay to get that intervention going. But it took a while. Somalia is another example. It was nominal support for a humanitarian operation to get food supplies to people, humanitarian supplies to people in Somalia during the big famine and civil war, I might add, during the early 90s. And after the events of Black Hawk Down, I don't know what else to call it, such as the power of Hollywood. After that happened, there was a huge pushback in the United States, and it was led by conservatives again. They just, why are we there? Why? What's the point? What's the security imperative? There just didn't seem to be any real interest at stake, and so they rebelled on that count, and the Clinton administration responded in kind by pulling the U.S. out of the operation. Let's see. Oh, quick note, you mentioned Costa Rica not having a military.
Mm-hmm.
That's cheating a little bit. Because they don't have a military, but they do have an alliance with the United States. So they kind of do have a military in so much as the U.S. military would defend them if they did come under attack. So they can kind of free ride to a degree. I don't think the United States really cares, because I don't think anybody expects Costa Rica would be able to field like a really powerful military. So it's not really any great loss that they don't have one, per se. But it's not entirely true that they just kind of threw caution to the wind and don't have a military just out of sheer pacifism. They do have a powerful ally to kind of back them that can kind of help them out.
If you mess with me, my big brother will beat you up.
Yeah. Well, foreign influencer may be more accurate. Super power backer. Let's see. What is your opinion on Washington State wanting to split in two and create the 51st state, Liberty? Is this something that would actually benefit both halves enough to actually be worth doing? Yeah, you might know more about this than I do, Neuro. I've heard about this happening like in the early mid 20th century, but I haven't heard about it recently.
Yes, so it's Eastern Washington. For people who don't know, there's a nice geographical feature called the Cascade Mountain Range. And on the west side of this mountain range, Washington State is one of the most liberal, aka progressive, places in the country. And on the east side, it's very conservative, very strong Christian base. That's where a lot of my family is from. It's also very different in terms of its appearance and wildlife. It's more desertous because a lot of the clouds that carry a bunch of rain just dump all their water and they don't go over the Cascades. So culturally it's very different, climate-wise it's very different. And basically what they want to do is make their own state with part of Idaho that is also very conservative. So it's just kind of that really stark contrast within a state that usually you think of Pacific states as being progressive in general, like Washington, Oregon, and California. But Washington is pretty split based on that mountain range and the disconnect between those people. You do have to drive a good bit. It kind of plays to that feature we've talked about a lot of different times about how the geography of the land shapes the countries and the cultures that form just by virtue of it's inconvenient to pass through this, so there usually ends up being a difference on either side of an obstacle. But yeah, Eastern Washington is conservative, so they feel like that if they teamed up with part of Idaho, then they would be able to contend with Western Washington more, which I'm not sure population-wise. I think Western Washington has more population and more pull, so Washington State ends up being a more progressive state overall, and they may feel like they don't really have much of a voice if they are strongly conservative.
And has there been recent traction on that? Have they been pushing more for that state lately?
I know I think they've been trying to get it passed and stuff, but a lot of it just seems like the drumming up of symbolic support. I don't know how feasible it actually would be. State-wise, I think Washington is doing quite well. It seems like the states that legalized cannabis have a new huge source of revenue, so it's not like they're low on cash at this point, because obviously you're going to tax that pretty hard since it is a drug. So it's kind of like alcohol and cigarettes, where they tax it a little bit harder because it has some health risks and it alters people in ways that are not performance enhancing.
Gotcha. Yeah, I hadn't heard anything. So unless I read something new about it, I'm inclined to kind of classify it as being in the same category as separatist efforts in other states, which are not really that serious. I know California there was sort of a nominal push to have California leave the Union a while back. I don't think anything came of that. I'm more familiar with Texas separatism, because we do have a Texas Independence Party here in Texas. But there's sort of this fringe group that nobody really knows about or cares about, and they don't really support.
Republic of Texas is the best country in the world.
It is at that. It is at that. So let's see. You mentioned it might be fun to talk about Vietnam, but I don't know about Vietnam. Is it about Vietnam that is interesting to you, or what would you like to discuss about the Vietnam in general? Now, this guy's asking the fun question. Yeah. So for those not familiar with the Vietnam War was a conflict that the United States fought in, as you can guess, Vietnam, through the 1960s and much of the 1970s. And it was a conflict that had a very complex genesis over time. It was very much a Cold War conflict. And nominally, it was fought to stop South Vietnam, which at that time was a separate country from North Vietnam, to stop South Vietnam from being conquered by communists, internal or external. That's a whole other discussion in and of itself. So nominally, that was the crux of the conflict. There's a lot more to it than that, and that's kind of what I find interesting, because it is such a complex conflict politically and militarily. And it's very unique, and it was sort of one of the first big counterinsurgencies the U.S. fought in the 20th century. There had been others, but Vietnam was the first one that had really been televised. So that was the first one that people in the U.S. kind of had a front row seat to. They saw every night on their televisions footage from Vietnam. So it was the first time that the American voting public had really seen a conflict like that. Before in World War II, you could see reels and stuff, footage from reels taken over in Europe or the Pacific and what have you. But a lot of the stuff there was a lot more media content being produced in Vietnam, and there was a lot more current. Some of it was being broadcast live by satellite, and so there was much greater access to the conflict than the people of the U.S. had ever had access to before, from a media perspective. It was the first war in which there was I don't want to say it's the first war in which saw significant helicopter usage. Because Korea, I think, technically qualifies as that. But Vietnam was up there. It was one of the first to really significantly use helicopters in the way that they did, certainly as a sort of air cavalry element. I don't think they used helicopters as air cavalry in Korea. I think they mostly used them for medevac, maybe transportation. So Vietnam was kind of known as the helicopter war. I believe that's the case. Somebody please correct me if I'm wrong. And it was hugely politically contentious in the United States. Kind of like what I was talking about before about isolationism never really going away. It was U.S. involvement in Vietnam was hugely controversial. A lot of the public didn't really understand why the U.S. was there. What's the point? What's the strategic interest? And the government made it a lot worse by lying incessantly. Kind of like with Iraq in the early days. The U.S. government early in the Iraq War, 2003, 2004, just spouted a lot of bullshit about what was going on. I remember one of the highlights was them saying that there wasn't an insurgency in Iraq. They really clung to that for a long time. There were several months when they just insisted that there was not an insurgency. No, really, it's just hangers-on. Don't worry about it. I don't think anybody really believed them, but they just kept pushing it. And it's, bullshit like that really alienates people because it kind of erodes your credibility. It erodes the public trust. And that's what happened in Vietnam. The Johnson administration, in particular, insisted that we were about to turn a corner. We're about to win the war. It's fine. Just we need to send a few more troops and stay, a few more months, and we'll turn it around. And they just kept having to do that over and over again because, of course, they never turned it around. There was always a new problem. It always just seemed to keep escalating. So that anti-war movement that the Vietnam War sparked ended up being very politically influential. And I think it's important to note here, because I think this is a point of some confusion. At least it was for me when I was a lot younger. I was still learning about the war. I'd always had this image when I was younger that the anti-war movement during the Vietnam War was something that was very much a leftist thing. That it was sort of like hippies and leftists that were supporting the anti-war movement. But it was actually pretty bipartisan. There was actually a lot of conservatives that also supported it. In general, I think more conservatives supported the war than leftists, or more conservatives supported the war than not, but there was a significant conservative element to the anti-war. It was pretty broad-based in a way that other movements were not. I think the civil rights movement was a lot more partisan in that regard, I think. So I think that kind of illustrates how much of a problem the Vietnam War was politically in the U.S. It was so contentious, and it really contributed to the really hostile political environment that defined the 1960s in the U.S. You could do the 1960s and the culture and political changes that happened in is a whole conversation in itself, not only in the United States, but elsewhere in the world. But the Vietnam War had a big part in that, so that's another interesting aspect to it. And just the counterinsurgency aspect, the military aspect to it is very interesting. The way that the United States military kind of struggled with the insurgents, the Viet Cong and the NBA infiltrators. So that military history is also interesting. Yeah, those are all different things we could get into. I think would be fun. I won't won't get into all of them here. It would take too long. But yeah, if anybody ever wants to ask about them, I'd be interested in seeing what I could remember. I'm not an expert by any stretch, but I can see what I could conjure. For people who are interested in learning more about the Vietnam War, there's 2 documentary series I would highly recommend. One of them is called, you see, I think I brought it up here, Vietnam, the 10,000 Day War. That's an older documentary series, and I think it's Canadian. That's what it says here anyway. And that's a good resource. And highly recommended is a documentary series called Battlefield Vietnam. Not the video game. There was a documentary series called Battlefield, I think it was British, that was mostly focused on World War II. And by the way, I highly recommend the World War II series, the versions of the series as well. Those are excellent, top-notch, probably some of the best quality documentaries on the subject you can find. But they also just kind of randomly had one season where they did Vietnam. I don't know why. It felt kind of weird, but their Vietnam War series was very good. I was very impressed, and I learned a lot from that. So those are 2 good documentary series I would highly recommend if you really want to kind of dig into the subject and learn more. Okay, so let's see. What was the difference and the relationship between the NVA and the VC? So the NVA is the North Vietnamese, and the VC are the Viet Cong, which was a political organization started in the South. And it was not exclusively communist. It actually was an umbrella organization that encompassed nationalists and other groups who wanted the unification of North and South Vietnam. The communists were the most important group, and the communists actually secretly ran the Viet Cong. They kind of did it on the sly, but they had basically infiltrated it and ran it as an arm of the Communist Party in South Vietnam, which was itself an extension of the Communist Party in North Vietnam. So basically, it was a North Vietnamese organization, but there was a fair amount of popular support for it, at least in the early years. So that's the Viet Cong. The NVA, again, the formal army of the actual country, North Vietnam. So the relationship between them is that the NVA was supplied, basically, the VC in the early years. Mind you, the relationship changed over time. Earlier in the war, it was mostly logistical. The NVA would infiltrate through the Ho Chi Minh Trail into South Vietnam, supplies that the VC needed, ammunition, guns, or maybe even some artillery here and there, probably more mortars than that. I guess I should explain Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was a logistical, basically, path, a route from North Vietnam into South Vietnam. And it didn't have it wasn't just a single route, it was just a multitude of routes that were taken to smuggle goods and weapons into South Vietnam to give them to the Viet Cong. A lot of them ran through neutral territory. One of the routes ran through eastern Laos, which is on the western border of South Vietnam. And that territory was nominally allied with the U.S., but the communists in Laos and North Vietnam basically took over eastern Laos, which sparked a civil war within Laos. That kind of fed into the quote-unquote secret war that came out later, that the CIA was mostly involved in. That's a whole other topic of discussion. But there was that one. There was also a path further north, and I think there was also a maritime path that moved up through Cambodia, which was sort of to the south, which was to the west, I think, of South Vietnam. So those are all just different logistical routes the NVA would use to supply the Viet Cong. Now, as the war went along, the Viet Cong suffered more and more attrition, and they had more and more trouble getting new recruits. And eventually, what happened was the Tet Offensive, which was one of the big moments in the war in 1968. The Tet Offensive was a major offensive organized by the communists in North Vietnam that involved the mobilization of basically every member of the Viet Cong that they had, in conjunction with some NVA troops that were infiltrated south. And the offensive was meant to be by rebels, insurgents, and soldiers all over South Vietnam to attack all of the major cities and a number of major U.S. bases. And the object of the offensive was to try to spark an insurrection, to spark a popular revolt by the broader population of South Vietnam against the South Vietnamese government. And in that way, they hoped to take over the South Vietnamese government and then get reunification that way. It ended up being a huge fiasco. It wasn't well, there was a lot of good planning that went into it, but the execution was very poor. And the end result was that the Viet Cong basically got wiped out in South Vietnam. And in that sense, it was again huge fiasco, specifically a military fiasco, because again the Viet Cong got wiped out, and after that there basically was no Viet Cong. Technically, on paper, they still existed, but almost all of the insurgent activity after that was being carried out by NVA troops who infiltrated into South Vietnam from North Vietnam. And by that point, counterinsurgency tactics and strategy was improving on the part of the South Vietnamese government and the US, so it was getting harder to operate. I think specifically by that time, the US was starting to move troops away from the frontier towards the more populated urban areas. The US really thought it could handle the insurgents easily. Like, the thought going in was, we could handle Vietnamese rebels, no problem. And their thinking was that they needed to focus on the infiltration routes that were on the frontier of South Vietnam's western and northern border. So that's where the US military mostly deployed. But the real battle was kind of more behind them, in the urban areas, the more populated areas where the VC were. And that's kind of where sort of Vietnamese civil war played out. And because the South Vietnamese military and police forces were not really quite up to snuff, they were not quite as professional, well-trained, well-equipped as the US, they had a lot more trouble keeping control of the countryside in particular. They held on to the cities, but a lot of rural areas were lost to rebels. But after '68, the US started to shift its posture such that its forces were more deployed in the east of the country, in those more populated areas. And that made it harder for the communists to operate as openly, and in turn it was harder for them to operate and be as successful. Now, of course, that gets into a whole conversation about, could the US have won Vietnam if it had stayed? That's a whole other conversation. If somebody wants to get into that, I guess next week we can do that. But for now, I would just say that to focus on the question at hand, the NVA basically replaced the VC at that point of the war, after the disaster of the Tet Offensive. Now, just as a side note, I would point out that while the Tet Offensive was a military disaster, it was actually a political victory. Because one of the things that happened before the Tet Offensive is that the Johnson administration had said that they were about to win the war. That things were, again, they had been basically saying continually, we're about to turn a corner, the war's about to end, we just need some more troops, a couple more months.
We just need a little bit more time.
But by that point, they'd been saying that for years, and their credibility was wearing thin. And at that point, they had also said that the insurgency is on the ropes, they're about finished. And then the Tet Offensive happens, and it becomes clear that they're not finished. Now, again, the Tet Offensive resulted in the annihilation of the Viet Cong, the de facto annihilation of the Viet Cong. But if you're an American citizen in the US and you've been hearing the government say the rebels are on, at the end of their rope, they're about to be finished, and then this offensive happens, it looks like the government has just been lying its ass off and that the war is just going to last on and on for years. From your perspective, it looks like the rebels are actually really powerful and managed to pull off this big offensive. And so the government lost a significant amount of credibility because of that. And that's one of the reasons public sentiment turned so sharply against the government after the Tet Offensive. It had already been trending against the war before that, but after Tet Offensive it really jumped, and that was really when the anti-war movement hit its stride. It was at that point that there was not really sufficient political support to maintain American involvement in the war. And at that point, the US government basically spent all of its time looking for a way out, trying to de-escalate and trying to find a way to stabilize the fighting, such that South Vietnam could kind of stand on its own with maybe limited American support, which of course led eventually to the controversial pulling of all American support later on by Congress. But that again is that's another story that we could do sometime. So let's see. So that's roughly the relationship between the NVA and the. Do you have a favorite historical battle for any reason, like Battle of Wisna or the Battle of Cassinal Itzer? I don't know that I do, really. I tend to hop around, whatever battle looks interesting, I study. So I don't know that I could say that I have a favorite. Stalingrad is always interesting. But I've also never really studied it in depth, so I don't know that I can call that a favorite. Yeah, I don't really have one. I guess that would have to be my answer. I'd have a specific battle that I would call my favorite. I guess if you, well, I guess I could say that maybe my favorite is the Battle of Fredericksburg, but I don't know how many people are familiar with that, especially since we have a lot of people from outside the U.S. listening. Battle of Fredericksburg was a major battle in the U.S. Civil War. That was fought in the, I want to say 1861, and that was a big victory for the Confederacy in the Civil War, and basically it involved the Confederacy holding a bridge against attempts by the Union Army to cross it, and they did not cross it very well. They basically did the dumbest thing you can do, which is just charge at the other side of the bridge. But a bridge is a natural choke point, so the Confederates were able to negate the Union advantage in numbers by just using that choke point and just cut down huge numbers of Union troops. Can't remember, that led to something. Antietam. I think it led to the Battle of Antietam later on, which technically was the most violent battle of the Unions. Or sorry, the U.S. Civil War, rather. Actually, more people were killed at Antietam than Gettysburg, which is the more famous battle. Actually, that does remind me about, there's also the Battle of Chancellorsville, which I think was the next year. And that was actually even cooler, because General Lee, leading the Army of Northern Virginia, was able to defeat a much larger Union army by splitting his army in three, which, if I remember correctly, was not something that was considered a good idea at the time.
Multi-prong attack.
Yeah. Well, it was a dangerous maneuver because it's when you do that, you kind of leave yourself vulnerable to a flanking attack. So each of your small pieces could be picked off in turn. But at the Battle of Chancellorsville, Lee was able to break his army in three pieces and defeat successive flanking attacks by the Union Army and turn the tables on them. It was a big upset victory, basically, for the South. And they were able to leverage Union defeat there into the later Battle of Gettysburg, was when the South actually invaded the North for episode. So those were some pretty interesting battles, what I remember of them anyway. Let's see. I think that's it for questions. Nice. It sounds like you're still in the middle of a match. Yes. Okay. So, what can I get into here? Oh, yeah, that was one of the things. So the trade negotiations between the U.S. and China are ongoing. And they could be coming to a close. There's been some signals coming out of the talks that the Trump administration and Beijing are getting close to a deal. So, real quick, I wanted to kind of look at what that deal might look like. For one, before I get into that though, one of the things that came out recently in the news is that Trump apparently asked China to immediately lift all agricultural tariffs, which is a pretty bold move. I don't think any country ever really wants to do that. Agriculture is always a very sensitive sector for every country because, you know, food supply. You know, any kind of dependency on foreign food imports is going to be a strategic liability. And also it's going to be controversial in the country because then your farmers are going to be competing with cheap import. And farmers tend to be an important constituency in most countries' politics. So aggravating them is generally not a good idea. So for those reasons, I don't think China is going to lift all of their agricultural tariffs. And I suspect really Trump knows that. I think he just asked that as a negotiating tactic. He's kind of notorious for asking for ridiculous things in a negotiation and then demanding concessions as the price of him walking back from those ridiculous requests. That seems to be a kind of consistent pattern in his negotiating style. Let's see. I'm going to guess that they'll probably partially lift some tariffs on some agricultural goods. That would be my prediction. Probably stuff that they don't produce much of. You know, they already import a lot of soybeans, so probably doesn't make a lot of difference to lift tariffs on those. And maybe some other classes of agricultural goods that they're already importing a lot of. But for stuff that has a lot of Chinese producers or stuff that is strategically sensitive, I doubt they would drop tariffs on those. So that was sort of the latest news out of the talks, and just kind of based on all of the releases and leaks we've heard from the talks, I constructed a possible picture of what a possible trade negotiation settlement would look like. And so some of that could involve, let's see what I've got here. For one, the U.S. might open its market to Huawei. That might be a little surprising since Huawei has been in the doghouse lately in the U.S. But that could be in the cards. Trump has already come out over the past couple weeks and said at one point that that the U.S. producers needed to be more competitive and that they couldn't rely on protections, basically. And so that kind of seemed like a hint, a signal that maybe he would open up markets to Huawei as a concession to get some Chinese concession in return. So there might be some agreement in that vein. U.S. might also, will lift its tariffs on Chinese goods. That's definitely going to be something the Chinese will want. So those Chinese tariffs will go away, or rather, the U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods will go away. And like I just said, the Chinese will probably lower their agricultural tariffs. Let's see. There will probably also be some agreement by the Chinese to have their state-owned enterprises buy more U.S. soybeans and U.S. semiconductors. We talked a little bit about that last week. That is something that the Trump came out and said that was being agreed to, or at least was going to be a part of an agreement. So I would infer that the Communist Party of China would agree to that and implement it by directing state-owned enterprises to import more of those goods from the U.S. There was also nominally a currency deal announced, and we have no details on that. So I'll speculate here and say that China is going to promise to not manipulate its currency, which it kind of already wasn't doing. That's another discussion we could have. But I think they'll come out and make that promise and allow the yuan to float in a wider band. Technically, the yuan is allowed to float, but not fully. It has a band within which it's allowed to float every day, basically. So it can float over time, but it's not going to dramatically shift in short periods of time because they have that restriction on the currency. So they might expand the degree to which the yuan can vary in value given time frame as a concession. I expect these are the substantive agreements that will be made. I also predict a lot of token agreements, token efforts by the Chinese government. I think they'll probably promise or maybe either promise to enforce IP protections for foreign companies, foreign IP better, or they'll pass some new laws. But again, I think they'll probably be mostly token. I think they'll also make a token effort to remove official, quote-unquote, local partner requirements. I suspect there will probably, in effect, de facto, still be some unofficial local partner requirements. That's going to be a little hard to verify. But I think they'll probably just offer it as a promise. There's no harm in that per se. I think there will also be a token effort to slightly raise the cap on the share of Chinese companies that can be owned by foreigners. Right now, I think it's 40%, something like that. So they might raise it a bit to like 45 or 49% or something like that. And maybe in particular industries or classes of technology, they might raise it to 51%. But I would be pretty surprised if they did more than that, if they opened it up significantly that. Let's see, and I think they might promise to wean state-owned enterprises off of government subsidies. Maybe also agreeing to accept U.S. steel and aluminum tariffs too. Because I don't think they're going to stop dumping. That's probably too big a policy reversal for China. So they might just agree to accept and not challenge U.S. steel tariffs on that count. But I don't know that promising to wean state-owned enterprises off of government subsidies is a big deal. That would be a big change for them. I don't think it's necessarily a problem to promise to do it over the long run, so they might do that. But I don't think they will probably actually do that. That's probably too much of a challenge to their industrial policy. We've kind of talked about Chinese political culture and preferences before. Let's see. So I think something else they'll do is reframe existing policy as a concession. So stuff that they were already planning to do, they'll probably trot it out as being an example of something they're giving up. So one of those things is lower tariffs on cars. That was already kind of in the cards. They want to introduce more import competition to the U.S. or to the Chinese auto industry to try to make them more competitive in export markets. Something else they were already doing is strengthening IP enforcement. They were already doing that because they are getting more concerned about Chinese IP getting stolen within China, possibly also outside China. So that was something they were already kind of trending toward. More import competition, kind of like with the cars, basically. In this case, I'm referring more generally to the increase in import competition they're trying to introduce in order to increase consumption as a proportion of economic activity. The Chinese government has been trying for years now to make the Chinese economy a consumption economy, and that's part of an effort to try to drive to make the Chinese economy less reliant on exports and external markets. It's also part of an effort to drive internal development to try to move Chinese producers up the value chain so that there are better, higher paying jobs and more opportunities generally. Having more consumption is seen as kind of being part of that process. Let's see. So I think they're trying to import more imports to try to give people more buying power. Imports are generally cheaper. They disrupt some Chinese production, but the trade-off is that people have more money in their pocket they can spend on other things. So that boosts the consumer market. Let's see. I don't think they're going to do a whole lot of that, but that's generally the trend. I'm not saying they're just going to completely open up their markets, just relatively more import competition, put it like that. Also, more access for U.S. financial services. They've also kind of been doing more of that as part of separate negotiations with the U.S. And that's also something what they want to do to try to modernize their financial sector, which is very inefficient and protected and not terribly competitive. So a few other items that might be part of the deal, but I'm not really sure. Maybe China and the U.S. will compartmentalize state-owned enterprises such that they're subject to separate tariffs. Their goods will be subject to separate tariffs, but private Chinese firms will not. That's something that they could hypothetically do, and that would kind of address the problem of state-owned enterprises. But I haven't heard anything about that, so I don't know if that's in the cards, and I don't really even know how feasible it would be, given the range of products that are produced by state-owned enterprises in China. It's also possible there might be some agreement on coordinating policy on North Korea and Iran. China's policy towards North Korea and Iran is kind of laissez-faire. They don't really want them to have nuclear weapons, so they also don't want to take the risk of actually doing something about it. So there might be some of that in the negotiations. I doubt it. I don't think so. I think the trade negotiations are difficult enough as is without throwing in denuclearization into it, but it's hypothetically possible. Let's see, they might also include labor protections and labor provisions. That's something that you kind of saw with the Mexico agreement. Well, not the Mexico agreement, the USMCA, the NAFTA renegotiation. One of the ways that they tried to get more factory production to relocate back to the U.S. is to try to require that Mexican manufacturers, well, technically all Canada or the U.S., a certain portion of goods produced in factories had to be made with labor that was paid above a certain wage in order to be eligible for the lower tariffs under NAFTA. So there could be something similar here with China, where they try to induce some manufacturing to come back to the U.S. by having that labor requirement, and by trying to get the Chinese to enforce labor protections, which would have the effect of making labor more expensive, and in turn less competitive compared to producing in the U.S. And they might do something similar with environmental provisions, basically for the same reason. And there might also be some provisions on digital trade. That's something that doesn't really get as much attention. But Trump had been complaining a few months ago about China and specifically Chinese digital traders like Alibaba, for example, having an unfair advantage because technically China's developing an economy, and as a developing economy, it has access to lower fares in international shipping. That was sort of an agreement made amongst internationally that less developed countries would have lower shipping rates, basically, just to kind of give them a little help in economic development. China technically still applies for that, and it was kind of considered a little unfair by the Trump administration, so they might have something there as well, but pure speculation on my part. So overall, the general outcomes, I think if the agreement negotiated does look like this, as I've outlined, I think U.S. businesses will be happy that they got some concessions and they have a little more opportunity in China. But I don't think that the underlying problems will have really been addressed with this kind of agreement. So U.S. business will probably become more upset over time, basically, as it becomes apparent that that fundamental underlying tension in the trade relationship is still kind of there. That being that U.S. firms don't really quite have that same access that they might have in other open markets. And I think there will also be more tension over Chinese investment in the U.S. and because of national security and technology fears. That's going to be a separate compartmentalized issue, I think. And there's also going to be continued consternation in the U.S. over Chinese industrial policy, which I don't think is something they're going to back off of. And I also predict if the deal does look like this, I suspect that Trump and the Trump administration will try to spin it as a win, basically. And you could argue that it would be. It is an advancement. It does represent a progression in the trade relationship, and it would resolve some issues. But I think they'll kind of spin it as like a grand solution, and then they'll kind of move on to negotiating with Europe, which seems to be kind of what they're vectoring in on. So you can also look forward to that. There's going to be trade negotiations with Europe going forward, I suspect. They've kind of been playing up the car tariff thing. The car tariff report that they were working on is supposed to come out pretty soon, and I think once it does, they're really going to kind of home in on Europe after the China negotiation. Maybe. Again, prediction on my part, but we'll see.
Blah, blah, blah.
Well, sweet. We had a nice 3 hours and a bit today. Strophium did a good job handing those questions along.
Yeah,
and we had
Strophium.
nice questions as usual. It's pretty sweet. We have a lot of people who said they loved the segment. I think there were 55 USD in donations
Oh,
for
wow.
your time. So that's
Thank you very much.
pretty awesome. Yeah, it's the usual mix of some people who are like, I can't wait till Agent Smith, yay, it's on. To the people who are like, what is this? Who is this guy?
Yeah.
What are his credentials? How many certificates does he have?
I have 3.
Someone said, I think this guy would do well at parties.
At what?
At parties, dude.
Oh. No.
Yeah, dude.
I've been to a few parties. I spend most of my time in the corner. I'm not a talker.
Well, it depends on the size of the party, right? Because Kukio, he was basically like a party host. People just come over and it's a party really often.
Yeah, I guess in that sense.
Yeah.
I just thought of those as get-togethers more than parties.
Well, the thing is, how loud is it? Because I think you're thinking of the noisy, everyone's getting drunk and there's music bumping and the cops show up. Like, that's a party.
Yeah.
But you also have the cozier, smaller scale party where it's between 3 and 7 people and it's a lot more quiet. You can hold conversation and stuff like that rather than trying to shout over loud music.
Yeah.
That's pretty different. Everyone's like, not a talker, what?
Well, I got, yeah, in that sense, did a fair amount of talking. This is pretty much what we used to do back in the day.
Yeah. Well, the difference too is having space to talk, because I think socially speaking, you're not really the type to talk over people. If there are a bunch of people talking, then you're gonna shout over them and make them stop talking with a louder voice. It's not really your style. But if someone gives you space, you can go for a long time.
Yeah, not always appropriate. My sense of timing is not always there. It was one of remember we went deep into the night one time during a movie break. Just wanted to get something to eat real quick, and that turned into a 2-hour thing about Italian history.
This could be fun, though. I think they can allow you to investigate stuff that normally you wouldn't give yourself the time to. And for me, it's really refreshing with the stream, because it breaks up my monotony of talking about StarCraft. And now we get to broaden it some.
Yeah, a little diversity.
Yeah. There will be the occasional viewer who they don't have the context of my 70 hours of StarCraft stream week, and they're like, I just want to hear about the gameplay. It's like, well, there's no shortage of that content, and my stuff is not subscription gated, so you can watch that on demand if you want to. But yep, it was really awesome having you on. Thank you again, Strophium, for handling the questions, and the chat for being magnificent. This will be on YouTube. Eventually, it will be highlighted in my Twitch VODs, probably tonight, tomorrow.
Cool.
So, yep, episode 49. We will see you for episode 50, and I will probably message you with some questions and stuff about if we want to hit a history topic. I can do some polls and things and figure out what the stream wants to hear about.
Yeah, no problem. Look forward to it.
Cool. Well, take care, Mr. Agent Smith.
Yeah, you too.
Nice. Nice.